He came to marry the golden one. He left carrying the forgotten one. The morning of the wedding, Celeste Vesper vanished, and every finger in that mansion pointed at her quiet, plain-dressed sister standing alone by the window. Marin Vesper didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg. That was the moment Dorian Vale, the most feared man in 3 cities, stopped walking toward the altar and started walking toward her. He lifted her off the ground in front of both families. He carried her out. No one stopped him. If you want to know why a mafia boss abandoned a golden bride and chose the scapegoat sister instead, stay until the end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The estate smelled like white roses and old money, which was to say it smelled like a lie dressed up for company. Dorian Vale arrived at the Vesper Gate at 9 in the morning, 40 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, because he had learned long ago that arriving early told you more about a place than arriving on time ever would. He came in a black car, no motorcade, no show. 2 men rode with him, Wren, who drove, and Callum, who sat in the back and kept his mouth shut unless Dorian asked him to open it. That was the reason Dorian kept Callum around. Most men in his position surrounded themselves with people who talked. Callum understood that silence was its own kind of loyalty. The Vesper estate sat on a hillside outside the city, the kind of property that had been in a family long enough that the family stopped noticing how much it cost to maintain. The iron gate was flanked by box hedges trimmed to military precision. A stone fountain in the forecourt had been freshly polished. White flowers were everywhere, wrapped around the gateposts, banked along the front steps, arranged in tall glass cylinders in the entrance hall that Dorian could see even from the car window. Someone had spent a great deal of money trying to make this day look inevitable. Dorian stepped out of the car before Wren had finished parking it. He straightened his jacket, glanced once at the fountain, and walked toward the front door. A Vesper family aide, young, sweating through his collar, met him at the top of the steps with the careful smile of a man who had been coached on what expression to wear. "Mr. Vale, we're so pleased. Is everything in order?" Dorian said. The aide blinked. "Sir?" "The ceremony, the families. Is everything in order?" "Yes, of course. Mrs. Vesper is just finalizing a few—" "Where's Celeste?" A flicker, so small that a less careful man would have missed it. But Dorian had spent 20 years reading the faces of men who were paid to lie to him, and he did not miss it. "She's getting ready," the aide said, "in her suite, with the family." Dorian looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded and stepped inside. The entrance hall was full of people moving at the controlled velocity of organized panic. Vesper family staff carrying flowers and folding chairs. 2 women from a catering company arguing in low voices near a side corridor. A man in a dark suit, security, not Dorian's, standing too close to the base of the main staircase with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Dorian walked through all of it the way he walked through everything, which was slowly and without announcing himself. He accepted a glass of water from a passing server, held it without drinking, and moved toward the interior of the house. He had been to the Vesper estate twice before. Once for the initial meeting with Aldrich Vesper, the family patriarch, when the terms of the alliance were first discussed. Once for a dinner 6 weeks later, after the formal agreement had been reached, when the families had performed the ritual of sitting across a table from each other and pretending they were friends. On both occasions, he had cataloged the house the way he cataloged every room he entered: exits, sight lines, structural details, the small signs that told him who actually lived here versus who was being staged for his benefit. The house was beautiful in the way that houses belonging to old families often were. High ceilings, dark wood floors, paintings that were genuinely old rather than decoratively aged. But he had noticed on his first visit that the east wing of the second floor was colder than the rest of the house. The heating registers in that corridor had been closed, not broken. Someone lived there and was not encouraged to be warm. He had filed that detail away without knowing what to do with it. He was thinking about it now, standing at the foot of the staircase while the aide tried to redirect him toward the garden, where chairs had been arranged in neat rows and a string quartet was tuning up with the slightly frantic energy of musicians who had been told to be ready and then told to wait. "Mr. Vale, if you'd like to wait with the other guests, where is Aldrich?" "He's with the family, upstairs, I believe." "Then I'll go upstairs." He went upstairs. The second-floor landing opened onto two corridors. The main corridor ran toward the west wing, where the larger family suites were, where the doors were currently closed but audibly populated with the murmur of voices and the occasional sharp note of a woman's raised pitch. Not crying, not yet, something closer to controlled urgency. Dorian stood at the top of the stairs and listened for 3 seconds. Then he turned east. The east corridor was exactly as he remembered, cooler, quieter. The wallpaper here was a different pattern than the rest of the house. Older, a pale stripe that had faded toward white. The rugs were thinner. There were no fresh flowers in this part of the hall. The door at the far end was partially open. He didn't announce himself. He walked to the door and looked in. The room was not large. A single bed, a narrow wardrobe, a writing desk under the window. The window looked out over the back of the property, away from the garden, away from the fountain and the flowers and the chairs. No decorations, no vanity table. A bookshelf along one wall with books that had been read, actually read. Spines cracked, pages worn at the corners, a few with slips of paper marking places. The woman sitting at the writing desk had her back to him. She was not dressed for a wedding. She was wearing a plain gray dress, long-sleeved, the kind of thing you put on when you want to be invisible, and her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She was writing something, a letter or notes, he couldn't tell, and she did not turn when he appeared in the doorway. "They'll want you back downstairs," she said. Her voice was even. Not startled, not performing calm. Simply even, the way a person sounds when they have been braced for interruption long enough that interruption no longer breaks their surface. "I'm not one of yours," Dorian said. She turned then. He had been given a photograph of Celeste Vesper, the photograph that the Vesper family had provided as part of the formal alliance documentation. And Celeste had been exactly what you would expect from a family that packaged its children for strategic use. Dark-haired, luminous, composed in the way that women who were raised to be looked at learn to be composed. Beautiful in a way that was legible from across a large room. This woman was not Celeste. She was younger by 2 or 3 years, or perhaps it was only that she looked younger because no one had spent years teaching her how to present herself for display. Her eyes were darker than Celeste's, set behind glasses that she hadn't bothered to remove, and her face was the kind of face that required more than a glance to register. Not plain, precisely, but arranged for function rather than performance. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already calculated. "You're Dorian Vale," she said. "Yes." "You're early." "I know." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the specific unfamiliar sensation of being read. Not examined for threat, not assessed for power, read, the way you read something written in a language you're not certain you've translated correctly. "You should go find my father," she said. "Where's Celeste?" A pause, just a beat, just the length of one breath held and released. "Getting ready," she said. The exact words the aide had used, the exact inflection that meant something else. Dorian stepped into the room. She didn't move back. She watched him cross the small distance between the door and the desk and stop close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to keep looking at him. And she kept looking at him, which told him something. "You're the other one," he said. "Marin." "Yes." "You knew I was early." "I heard the gate. You didn't come downstairs." "I wasn't asked to." He looked at the desk. The paper she'd been writing on had a column of numbers on it. Not household accounts, not a shopping list. A ledger format, tight and precise. The kind of notation that belonged in a financial document rather than a personal letter. She turned the paper over without appearing to think about it. The gesture was smooth enough that it might have been unconscious. Dorian didn't believe it was unconscious. "Where's your sister?" he said. Marin Vesper looked at him through those glasses, her hands folded now on top of the overturned paper, and said nothing. That was the first moment he understood that something in this house was wrong, in a way that the flowers and the fountain and the arranged chairs had been specifically designed to prevent him from noticing. He went back downstairs. The west corridor erupted 12 minutes later. He heard it from the garden, where he had gone to look at the chairs and the quartet, and think about the expression on Marin Vesper's face when he'd asked her where her sister was. He heard a door, then voices climbing above the register that people use when they're trying to stay private. Then Aldrich Vesper's voice, which was the voice of a man who had spent decades using volume as a substitute for authority, dropped from the second-floor window in a phrase that Dorian caught only the end of. Something about making calls, something about finding her, something that had the rhythm of a command that was not going to be obeyed. He walked back inside. The entrance hall had transformed. The controlled panic of 40 minutes ago had collapsed into actual panic, and the difference between the two was visible in the faces. Catering staff had stopped pretending to work. The Vesper family aide was on his phone in the corner, speaking quietly with the body language of a man delivering bad news to someone who didn't want to hear it. Two women who had arrived with the flower arrangements were pressed against the far wall, watching the staircase. Aldrich Vesper came down the stairs with the contained fury of a man who had managed situations all his life and was currently failing to manage one. He was broad-shouldered and gray-templed, and wore the expression of someone who had rehearsed dignity for so long that he performed it automatically even when he was falling apart underneath it. Behind him came his wife, Petra, who was a different kind of controlled. Rigid, precise, her face locked in the particular blankness of a woman who had learned to make her face say nothing when her body wanted to say too much. Behind both of them, at the top of the stairs, stood Marin. She had not changed her dress. She still wore the gray. She stood at the top of the staircase with her hands at her sides, and her face composed in a way that Dorian recognized, because he had seen it before, downstairs in her room. The expression of a person who has already survived the thing that is about to happen to everyone else. Aldrich reached the base of the stairs and saw Dorian and stopped. There's been a... He cleared his throat. A complication. Celeste, Dorian said. Something moved across Aldrich's face. Not surprise at the inference, but something colder. Calculation, brief and involuntary, the flicker of a man rearranging his story in real time. She's not... We can't locate her at the moment. She's gone, Petra said from behind her husband, and her voice had no expression in it at all, which was its own kind of expression. The room went very still. Dorian let the stillness sit for a moment. He did not look at Aldrich. He looked at the assembled room, the aide on his phone, the staff along the walls, the guests who had begun filtering in from the garden when they heard the change in the house's atmosphere. Then he looked up at the top of the stairs. Marin had not moved. How long? Dorian said. Her bed wasn't slept in, Aldrich said. We don't... Since last night? We believe. It's possible she left during the... You knew this morning, Dorian said, before I arrived. Aldrich said nothing. That was its own answer. Dorian turned the glass of water in his hand. He was still holding it, had been holding it for 30 minutes without drinking, and set it down on a side table with the precise, deliberate movement of a man choosing not to do several other things. Then there's no ceremony, he said. He said it quietly. The room received it the way rooms receive quiet statements from men who are not accustomed to being questioned, completely, and with a collective exhale of relief that was immediately followed by a collective intake of anxiety, because the absence of a ceremony was not the end of the problem. The problem was still in the room. Aldrich's face had moved through 3 expressions in 4 seconds: relief, recalculation, and now something harder. The alliance can be discussed at a later time, Dorian said. Dorian. Aldrich lowered his voice, stepped closer. There are family members here. There are guests. This kind of disruption, the implications, are yours to manage. I'm asking you to consider, where did she go? Dorian said. Aldrich blinked. You have a missing daughter and you're talking to me about implications. Where did she go? We don't know, Petra said. The same flat voice. She had come all the way down the stairs now and stood beside her husband with her hands clasped in front of her, and she was looking at Dorian the way people look at a problem they've been hoping would solve itself. She left a note, said a voice from the top of the stairs. The room turned. Marin was standing 1 step lower than she had been, her hand on the banister, the paper in her other hand extended, not offering it so much as making it visible. The paper was small, personal stationery, and even from this distance Dorian could see that it was brief. A few lines. The handwriting of someone who had made a decision and wanted to be precise about it. Aldrich turned and looked up at his younger daughter with an expression that moved from surprise to something that Dorian watched crystallize in approximately 2 seconds into anger. Where did you get that? Aldrich said. She left it in my room, Marin said. Why would she? Because she knew you'd destroy it before Dorian saw it, Marin said. The room did not breathe. Aldrich's face had gone through another transformation. The dignity performance had slipped. What was underneath it was uglier. The face of a man who had been managing his household like a chess game and had just watched one of his pieces make an unauthorized move. Give that to me, Aldrich said. No, Marin said. She said it the same way she said everything else, even, unhurried, without emphasis. But she had come down 3 more steps, and she was holding the letter in a way that indicated she would not give it up without a physical confrontation, and the room seemed to understand this, because no one moved. Dorian held out his hand. Marin came down the rest of the stairs. She walked past her father, who did not touch her, and the decision not to touch her was a visible thing, a restraint that cost something. And she crossed the entrance hall and placed the letter in Dorian's hand. He read it. It was 8 lines. Celeste Vesper had a clean, precise script, and she had used it to write 8 lines that said she was not returning. She was not marrying Dorian Vale. She was sorry for the disruption she had caused. She was not sorry for the decision she had made. She asked that no one look for her. She did not say where she was going. She did not name another person. She did not explain anything beyond what the 8 lines contained, which was everything and nothing. Dorian folded the letter. He put it in his jacket pocket. Aldrich was watching him with the expression of a man bracing for the detonation of something he had built. The Alliance, Aldrich began again. I heard you, Dorian said. Dorian. Aldrich stepped closer, lowered his voice further. We have options. The terms of the agreement were about a union between our families, not a specific individual. There are ways to honor the spirit of... You're suggesting a replacement, Dorian said. I'm suggesting that the alliance doesn't have to end because I just watched your daughter deliver her sister's letter to me over your objection, Dorian said. He said it without inflection, without heat, which made it land differently than heat would have. Before I hear another word about alliances, I want to understand what kind of family I'm forming one with. The room had gotten very small. Aldrich's jaw had tightened. Petra had gone perfectly still. The guests who had drifted in from the garden were watching with the helpless fascination of people witnessing something they hadn't been warned was on the program. Marin was standing 4 feet from Dorian, off to his left, and she was looking at a point somewhere past her father's shoulder with an expression that he could not read anymore, which was different from the composed expression she'd been wearing for the last hour. This was something else. Something that had been doing its job for a long time and was very tired. She did what any person would do, Petra said, and her voice had changed, taken on a tone that was not quite defensiveness, but had the same direction. She was looking at Marin. She interfered, as she always does, in matters that... She handed me a letter, Dorian said. That's not interference, that's information. She's been nothing but a disruption to this family for... Mother, Marin said. Just the word. Quiet as everything else, she said. And Petra stopped, which was interesting because Petra Vesper did not seem like a woman who was accustomed to being stopped by her younger daughter. Dorian looked at Marin. She was looking back at him now. The tired expression had not left her face, but behind it there was something watchful. The look of a person tracking something, following it as it moved. He thought about her room, the closed heating registers, the worn books, the overturned paper with the columns of numbers. The way she had said you should go find my father with the voice of a woman who knew exactly what he would find when he did. She had known. Not that Celeste would leave, or perhaps that too, he wasn't certain yet, but that something would go wrong. She had been sitting in her cold room in her gray dress, writing columns of numbers, because she had understood, with the clarity of a person who has been watching a situation develop for a long time, that the morning would not go the way the morning had been staged to go. The guests were murmuring. Someone near the door had their phone out, which was going to be a problem that Callum would need to address. Aldrich was building toward something. Dorian could feel it, the gathering of a man who was about to make a speech about family honor and long-term strategic interests, and how mature parties handled unforeseen complications. Petra was looking at her daughter with an expression that was not grief and was not anger, but was something related to both. The look of a woman who has decided that the nearest available person is the cause of the problem she is currently standing inside. Dorian made a decision. It was not a strategic decision. He would think about that later. would turn it over in the days that followed, would examine it for calculation and find almost none. But in the moment it arrived complete, the way decisions arrive when you've been watching a situation long enough that the right move simply becomes visible. He walked to Marin. She watched him come. She didn't step back. She didn't change her expression. She stood in her plain gray dress with the stillness of someone who had stopped being surprised by the world a long time ago. And she looked at him, and he bent and put one arm under her knees and one arm across her back and lifted her. She made a sound, not a protest, more like a breath that had been startled out of her. And then she was still, and she was looking at his face from approximately 8 inches away, and her expression had done something it hadn't done in the entire 90 minutes he'd been in this house. It had cracked open, just for a second. Just enough that he saw what was underneath the composure. The room erupted. Aldrich's voice, Petra's voice, 2 or 3 guests, the aide on his phone dropping it, Callum at the door already moving into position because Callum understood, without being told, what Dorian walking toward an exit while carrying someone meant. "What are you doing?" Aldrich, not a question, the voice of a man who has encountered a variable he did not account for. "Vale, put her down. This isn't... What are you doing?" Dorian walked toward the front door. "She has nothing to do with the Alliance," Aldrich said, louder now, following. She's not part of this. You have no right to..." "You were about to suggest she was a replacement," Dorian said, still walking. "I'm agreeing." "That's not what I..." "It is," Dorian said. He reached the front door. Callum had it open. The morning light came through, white and clean, and the stone steps were laid out ahead of him like the last 30 seconds of a decision he had already made. "You don't know anything about her," Aldrich said from behind him. Dorian stepped through the door. He carried Marin Vesper down the front steps of the estate in her plain gray dress, past the stone fountain, past the box hedges, toward the black car that Wren was already pulling around to the front. He felt her weight in his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, he thought, the way a person is when they have been given less than they needed for a long time. And he felt her hand, which had found his jacket lapel at some point during the walk, not gripping, just resting there, steady. He reached the car. Wren had the door open. He lowered Marin onto the back seat, and she moved herself across to make room for him, and he got in, and the door closed, and Callum got in the front. Through the rear window, Dorian watched Aldrich Vesper standing at the top of his stone steps with his arms at his sides, getting smaller. The gate opened. They drove through. Neither of them spoke for a full minute. The estate fell behind them. The city appeared ahead, gray and real and unheroic, the kind of city that continued regardless of what happened to the people inside it. "You didn't have to do that," Marin said. Her voice was back to what it had been, even, unhurried. But something in the evenness had changed. There was a hairline fracture in it that he suspected she was aware of. "No," he agreed. "They'll say you took me. Let them." She turned her head and looked at him. The glasses, the gray dress, the hair still pulled back without ceremony, and those eyes, which were not decorative eyes but thinking eyes, already working on whatever came next. "You read the letter," she said. "Yes." "Did you understand it?" He looked out the window. The city was coming up around them. Buildings, traffic, the ordinary machinery of a morning that had nothing to do with weddings. "Celeste didn't leave because she didn't want to get married," he said. A pause. Long enough that he counted 3 city blocks. "No," Marin said. "She didn't. She left because someone told her to." Marin said nothing. "And you knew," he said. Marin was quiet for another block. Then she turned back to looking out her own window, at her side of the city, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that contained more information than any answer she might have given out loud. He thought about the paper on her desk, the columns of numbers, the way she had turned it over without thinking, smooth, practiced, the reflex of a person accustomed to hiding work from anyone who might walk through their door. He thought about the locked heating registers in the East Corridor. He thought about a family that had staged a wedding with white roses and a polished fountain and fresh flowers in every window, and put their quiet daughter in a cold room at the far end of the hall in a plain dress, and had, in the space of approximately 20 minutes, moved from losing one daughter to redirecting the damage onto the other one. He thought about Marin standing at the top of the stairs with the letter in her hand, saying no to her father in a voice that had no anger in it, only certainty. And he thought, for the first time since this morning began, for the first time since the iron gate and the sweating aide and the white flowers that smelled like a lie, that he had walked into a situation whose surface he had been reading correctly and whose depth he had not yet begun to understand. "We're going to the East House," he told Wren. "Yes, sir." He looked at Marin. She was still watching the city. "You're going to tell me what's in those columns," he said. She didn't turn, but her hand, which was resting on her knee, closed slightly, fingers curling in by a centimeter, the only visible sign that she had heard him and that the words had landed somewhere specific. "Eventually," she said. Not a refusal, not a concession, a timeline. Dorian leaned back in the seat and watched the city fold around them and decided, without fully knowing why, that eventually was good enough for now. The East House was what Dorian called the property on Krenner Street that he used when he did not want to be in the main residence, which was the house his uncle Silas Vale had chosen for him 6 years ago, when Dorian had first consolidated the territory and needed an address that communicated permanence. The main residence was on a corner lot in the Aldermere district, large, appropriate, the kind of house that looked the way a man in his position was supposed to look. He had lived in it for 6 years and had never felt like himself there in a way that he had eventually stopped trying to articulate. The East House was smaller. 3 floors, Krenner Street's middle terrace block, unremarkable from outside, which was why he kept it. He had bought it 4 years ago without telling Silas, which had required some arrangement around the paperwork, because Silas tended to track Dorian's acquisitions with an attention that sometimes exceeded what an uncle's interest in a nephew's finances should require. He had told himself, when he bought it, that every man needed a place that wasn't monitored. He still believed that. He believed it more lately. Wren pulled up to the Krenner Street property at 10:40 in the morning. Callum went in first. Standard protocol. Not because the house was unsafe, but because standard protocol existed for the same reason all protocols existed, which was so that the one time it actually mattered, you hadn't gotten out of the habit. Marin got out of the car and looked at the building the way she had looked at him earlier, without visible reaction, assessing. "This isn't your main house," she said. "No." "Does anyone know about it?" He looked at her. "Why do you ask that?" She looked back at him steadily. "Because where you take me in the next hour is going to determine what my family does next. If this address is known to them, we have a shorter timeline than if it isn't." Dorian considered that for a moment. Then he said, "Inside." She went inside. Callum had done his check and was standing in the front room, which Dorian used as an office when he was here. A desk, 3 chairs, a window overlooking the narrow street. Not comfortable in any deliberate way. Functional. Marin stood in the center of the room and took it in. She did not touch anything. She did not sit. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the desk, the window, the single shelf of files along the east wall, and she was very quiet. "Your family will contact mine within the next 2 hours, Dorian said. He sat on the edge of the desk, which was not a posture he used with people he was trying to intimidate, which was part of why he chose it. "They'll want to negotiate. They'll frame what I did as an abduction and offer a resolution that involves me returning you." "Yes," she said. "I'm not going to return you." She looked at him. "Not because I've decided anything about you," he said. "Because I want to know what you know before I sit across a table from your father again." Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What makes you think I know anything?" "The numbers on your desk?" A beat. "The way you said Celeste didn't leave on her own?" Another beat. "The fact that you were dressed and ready and sitting in your room at 9 in the morning instead of getting prepared for a wedding you were supposed to be present at." He watched her. "You weren't surprised when she was gone. You were waiting for what came next." Marin moved to one of the chairs and sat down. She crossed her legs and set her hands in her lap and looked at him the way she had looked at him in the car, with the eyes of a person who is doing arithmetic in real time. "Celeste is not going to be found," she said. "Not by my family. Not by you. She's been planning this for 8 months. She has money, documents, and a route that doesn't use any name you'd know to look for. By the time anyone starts looking in the right places, she'll be 3 countries removed." "You helped her," Dorian said. "I made sure she had what she needed." "Why?" Marin looked at him for a long moment, not arranging the answer, working out how much of it to give him. Because they were going to use her, she said. Not you, not the Alliance. My father and your uncle were going to use the marriage as a mechanism to move funds from your accounts into a structure that neither of you would control. Celeste was the distraction. The wedding was the distraction. The actual transaction was going to happen in the back end of the paperwork, in clauses buried in the Alliance documentation that neither you nor Celeste would have had reason to examine closely. The room was very quiet. Dorian did not move. He held the stillness of a man who has been told something he had not verified and was now in the process of deciding whether it was true. You're saying my uncle... I'm saying Silas Vale and my father have been working together for 14 months, Marin said. Outside the Alliance framework, outside your knowledge. The Alliance was cover. The wedding was the execution mechanism. Dorian looked at her. And how long have you known this? He said. Marin held his gaze without flinching, which was not easy to do, which he was aware of, which told him something. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer. No, she said. It's not. He pushed off the desk and walked to the window and looked at the narrow street and the ordinary morning light and the city that continued to be a city regardless of what was happening inside this room. He thought about Silas, his father's brother, the man who had been in the room when Dorian first took control of the territory, who had helped him build the infrastructure of the first 3 years, who had sat across tables from him at weekly meetings for 6 years and given advice that Dorian had trusted because the advice was always good, had always proven right, which was itself worth examining now from a new angle. He thought about the Alliance. He had not wanted it, not particularly. It had been Silas who framed it as necessary, who had laid out the case for a Vesper connection with the clean logic of a man who had done his research, who understood the value alignment, who could see the long game. Dorian had agreed because the argument was sound, and because he had learned to trust Silas's arguments when they were sound. He thought about the documentation. He had read it. He had had his own lawyers read it. He was not a careless man with paper. But he also knew, in the specific knowledge of a man who had spent 20 years in rooms where the surface of things was professionally maintained, that a careful enough construction could pass through lawyers without detonating. That sufficiently buried language could mean something different than what it appeared to mean if you knew where to look and had reason to look there. He had not had reason to look there. He turned back to Marin. You have the documents, he said. She looked at him. The columns on your desk, he said. That's not accounting for your personal finances. That's a tracking structure. Someone who does that kind of work does it because they're building a case. Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I didn't come to your wedding empty-handed, Mr. Vale. The sentence landed in the room like the first stone dropped into still water. Not loud, not violent, but with the particular resonance of something that is going to keep sending out rings for a long time. Dorian looked at the woman in the plain gray dress, with the worn glasses and the careful hands folded in her lap, and understood, with the slow, absolute clarity of a man whose sight had just been corrected, that he had not rescued her this morning. She had been waiting for him. She had been waiting for him, and he had arrived, and whatever she had walked into the Vesper estate prepared to do, whatever case she had built in her cold room over 8 months of closed heating registers and overturned papers, it had just followed her into his east house on Krenner Street, and it was sitting across from him in a gray dress, looking at him with the patient eyes of someone who knew they were in the right room. He sat back down on the edge of the desk. Tell me, he said. Outside, the city moved without them. The morning continued. The white flowers at the Vesper estate were probably already being removed, the chairs folded, the fountain unmanned, the string quartet packing up their instruments and asking each other quietly what had happened. Marin Vesper looked at Dorian Vale and began. She did not begin with the beginning. She began with a number. 11.4 million, Marin said. That's the amount that was going to move in the 72 hours following the wedding. Not through your accounts directly. Through a layered structure that your signature on the Alliance documentation would have authorized without naming. The clause is in Addendum 3, subsection 9, under the language about joint operational infrastructure. It reads like a standard indemnity arrangement. It isn't. Dorian was still on the edge of the desk. He had not moved since she started. His hands were flat on his thighs, and his face had the particular stillness of a man doing rapid internal work behind a controlled exterior. Show me, he said. Marin reached into the dress. He had not noticed the inside pocket. It was sewn into the left side seam, not a standard feature on a dress that plain, which meant she had put it there herself, or had it put there. She withdrew a folded envelope and held it out, and he took it and opened it. Inside were 4 pages, printed, dense with text that had been marked in several places with a very fine pen. Not highlighter, not thick annotation, the precise underlining of a person who wanted their markings to be readable without drawing attention to themselves on a quick glance. He read. She let him read without filling the silence, which he appreciated more than he was prepared to say. Most people, when they handed someone a document they wanted to be believed, talked while it was being read. Talked to manage the reading, to pre-interpret, to influence the landing. Marin sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked at the window and let the document do its own work. He finished the 4 pages. He went back to subsection 9 of Addendum 3 and read it twice more. She was right, not approximately right. Not right in the way that a smart person making inferences can be right. Exactly right, with the precision of someone who had spent significant time with the original text and understood not only what it said, but what it had been designed to look like. It said to someone reading at the speed of trust. He folded the pages back into the envelope. "How did you get this?" he said. "I asked Celeste to photograph it," Marin said. "Before the formal signing, she had access to the documentation through my father's study. She understood what she was photographing, even if she didn't entirely understand what it meant yet." "Your father let her see the documents?" "My father let Celeste see everything," Marin said. "She was the golden one. She was allowed in rooms. The way she said it, not bitter, not performing the absence of bitterness, simply stating a fact that had long since been incorporated into the structure of her daily existence, told him more about the Vesper household than anything he had observed in 2 prior visits. "And you weren't," he said. "I was useful when I was invisible," she said. "That's a different kind of access." Dorian set the envelope down on the desk beside him. He looked at the far wall, at the shelf of files, at nothing in particular. He was thinking about Silas. He was thinking about 6 years of weekly meetings and trusted counsel and good advice, and he was thinking about how good advice given for the right reasons and good advice given as part of a longer construction were identical in every way except the construction, and that the construction was only visible if you knew to look for it. "Who else knows about this?" he said. "No one who will say so." "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one," she said. "The people who know are the people who built it. Your uncle, my father, 2 others whose names I have but whose positions I haven't fully mapped yet. Anyone outside that circle who encountered the structure was paid to file it and forget it. Lawyers. 1, and an accountant who no longer works in this city." Dorian looked at her. "You tracked an accountant." "I tracked the gap," she said. "When someone disappears from a position abruptly and the official reason doesn't fit the timeline, there's usually something filling that gap that isn't in any record. I found the payment. The accountant had already gone, but the payment trail told me enough." He was quiet for a moment. 8 months, he said. 14, she said. "I've known something was structurally wrong for 14 months. It took me 8 months to build enough documentation to know what it actually was." "You did this alone." She didn't answer that directly. "Celeste helped when I asked her to. She didn't fully understand the scope until recently. When she did, she chose to leave rather than go through with a wedding that would have made her complicit." "Or made her a liability," Dorian said. Marin looked at him steadily. "That too." He got off the desk and walked to the window again. The street outside was quiet. A woman pushing a stroller, a delivery van double-parked halfway down the block, pigeons on the opposite roofline. The completely ordinary texture of a city morning that had no idea what was being discussed 3 floors above street level, in a house that wasn't on any of Dorian Vale's official paperwork. He thought about what it meant that the wedding had been staged, that Celeste had been positioned as bait, positioned by her own father, which required a specific kind of relationship between a parent and a child that Dorian did not want to spend too much time examining because it made his jaw tighten in a way he didn't particularly like. That the man he had trusted longest and most automatically had been operating a parallel structure inside Dorian's own empire for over a year. He thought about the meetings, what had been decided in them, what he had authorized, what he had signed. "The charity accounts," he said. He said it to the window. Behind him, Marin was very still. "Tell me about the charity accounts," he said. A long pause. "They're clinics," she said finally. 3 of them, funded through a charitable structure that runs on the edge of your operational territory. They serve women and children who've been displaced by the kind of displacement that doesn't get reported. The funding is legitimate on its face. The source is less straightforward. He turned around. You built them, he said. She met his eyes. I set up the financial architecture. Celeste's name is on the front-facing documents because my name would have drawn attention in that context. And the funding source is routed through 3 accounts that your uncle believes are operational contingency funds. She said it evenly. They're not. They never were. I redirected them 18 months ago when I first identified the scope of what Silas was building. I needed resources that couldn't be traced back to me directly, and I needed them to go somewhere that would be difficult to shut down without attracting scrutiny. Dorian stood very still. You took money from accounts in my territory, he said. I took money from accounts that Silas had already earmarked for a conspiracy against you, she said. I put it into clinics that provide medical care to people who have nowhere else to go. If you want it back, I can produce every transaction record. The room had changed temperature without changing temperature, which was a thing that happened in rooms where 2 people were approaching the outer edge of what civility could contain. That's not the point, Dorian said, and his voice had a flatness in it that was different from his earlier flatness. Quieter, in a way that was louder. No, she said. The point is that I used resources from your territory without your knowledge or consent, and that's a violation of a boundary you have every reason to hold. I know that. Then why? Because I weighed it, she said. I weighed it against doing nothing while Silas and my father finished what they were building, and I decided that doing something wrong was better than doing nothing. You decided, he said. Yes. For my territory. For accounts under my name. For children, she said, in 3 clinics that are still operating, that operated through this morning and will continue operating tomorrow regardless of what you and I decide to do in this room. Dorian looked at her for a long time. She held the look without deflecting, without softening it, without performing anything. She had done what she had done, and she had explained why, and she was not apologizing for it, and she was not pretending it was uncomplicated. He found that he could not argue with it. Not because he agreed with it. He didn't, not fully, not yet, but because it was internally consistent in a way that his anger couldn't find purchase on. She had weighed it. She had decided. She had operated with the resources available to her in a situation where the alternatives were limited, and she had pointed the output at something that was hard to condemn regardless of the methodology. He had done the same thing, in different rooms, on different scales, with different stakes. He had done exactly the same thing many times. He sat back down. You need to understand something, he said. All right. If this is verified, the documentation, the accounts, Silas's involvement, the response is going to be something that can't be undone. I don't dismantle 14 months of a man's work quietly. There's no version of this where I take apart what he built and everyone goes home. I know, she said. People who built it with him will need to be removed. I know. Including, possibly, members of your family. She did not look away. I know that too. And you're still sitting here. I'm still sitting here, she said. He studied her face, the gray dress and the glasses and the hair pulled back, and underneath all of that the face of a woman who had spent 14 months building a case in a cold room in her family's house, alone, using whatever access she could manufacture from her position as the invisible daughter, and who had walked into a wedding this morning knowing it would collapse, and knowing what she was going to do when it did. Why me? He said. You had the documentation. You could have gone to... Who? She said. Flat. A genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Who would I go to? Law enforcement that your uncle has cultivated for 6 years? A legal system that would require me to surface information that would immediately put me at risk with both families? I needed someone with the resources to act on the documentation and the motivation to act on it now. She looked at him steadily. You're the only person in this situation who is being actively harmed by what they built. Everyone else is either benefiting or irrelevant. So you used me. I gave you information that you needed, she said. Whether that's use depends on what you think you're owed. He almost laughed. It didn't reach his face fully, but something moved in it. A shift at the corner of his mouth, that surprised him as much as anything had surprised him in the last 2 hours. "You're not what your family thinks you are," he said. "No," she said. "I spent a long time making sure of that." A knock at the door, 2 short, 1 long, Callum's signal. Dorian straightened. "Come!" Callum opened the door. He was holding his phone at his side, which meant the call had already happened, and he was reporting the result rather than interrupting for a live one. "Aldrich Vesper," Callum said. "And Silas." Dorian went still in a different way. "Together?" he said. "Same call." Silas initiated. "Your uncle wants a meeting. Today." Aldrich's added his voice at the end. Sounds like he was in the room. "They're requesting the Aldermere house, 3 o'clock. Dorian looked at the window, then back at Callum. "Tell them I'm available. Aldermere, 3 o'clock. Callum nodded and pulled the door closed. Marin had shifted in her chair. A small adjustment, the movement of a person recalibrating. "They moved fast," she said. "They had a contingency," Dorian said. "They prepared for something going wrong today. The speed tells me this is the contingency running, not improvisation." "Then the meeting isn't a negotiation," she said. "It's a containment attempt." "Yes." "What they want to contain is me," she said. "Not with alarm. The way a person states an operational fact." "You, and what you might have told me," Dorian said. "So the question is what you let them believe you know." He looked at her. "Or what you let them believe I know." She held his gaze. "That's a different conversation." "It's the same conversation," he said. "You came here with documentation and a strategy. The documentation I now have. The strategy. I don't know all of it yet. Before I walk into a room with my uncle and your father at 3 o'clock, I need to know how much of it I'm carrying." Marin was quiet. Outside, the delivery van on the street ground its gears, pulling away from the curb, and the sound filled the room briefly and then left. "The strategy was always to get the documents to you," she said. "Everything else was architecture to make that possible." "The wedding." "The wedding was the only scenario in which I had a legitimate reason to be in the same physical space as you. My family doesn't use me as a social asset. I don't attend Vesper business meetings. I don't exist in the intersections where our families have operated." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "The wedding was the one event where my presence was expected. I needed to be present at the moment the structure collapsed, so that you would see me standing in the wreckage, so that you'd ask why." The room received this quietly. Dorian thought about it, about the precision of it, the patience required to build 8 months of documentation toward a single morning, to arrange yourself in the right place at the right moment, and trust that the person you needed to see you would see you and would draw the right conclusions. He thought about how many things had to go exactly right for it to work, how many variables she had been unable to control. "What if I hadn't gone upstairs?" he said. "Then I would have found another way to get the envelope to you," she said. "The plan had fallbacks." "What were they?" She looked at him in a way that suggested the fallbacks were not something she intended to disclose in the first 2 hours of their acquaintance, and that she trusted him to understand why. He did understand why. "Fine," he said. He stood up. "You're staying here. Callum will be outside." "I don't need a guard." "He's not a guard," Dorian said. "He's a notification system. If anyone approaches this address, I want to know before they reach the door." Marin looked at him steadily. "Is there a reason someone would approach this address?" "Your family knows where you are by now," he said. "They may not know the specific address, but they know you're with me. Whether they send someone to negotiate or someone to extract, I don't know yet. I won't know until I know what the meeting this afternoon is actually about." She absorbed this. She did not argue it. "There's a room on the 2nd floor," he said, "at the end of the hall on the right. It has a lock that works. I'd suggest using it." "Are you telling me to stay in a room?" she said. "I'm telling you the room has a lock," he said. "What you do with that is up to you." He took the envelope from the desk, put it inside his jacket, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. She was still sitting in the chair, watching him with the patient, measuring eyes of a woman who had been playing a longer game than anyone in this city had noticed. "Marin." "Yes." "The clinics," he said. "How many people?" She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a loosening of the guard around it. "In total, over the 18 months. Between 200 and 300. Women, mostly. Some children. The youngest was 4 months old when she came in. He stood in the doorframe for a second longer than was necessary. Then he said, "I'll be back before 5," and left. Callum was in the corridor and they walked to the front together, and Dorian said nothing, and Callum, who understood when nothing was the correct thing to say, said nothing back. The drive to the Aldermere house took 20 minutes, and Dorian spent the first 10 of them looking out the window at the city and the last 10 looking at nothing, doing the arithmetic of a situation that had expanded well beyond the shape he had assigned it this morning when he had stood at the top of a hillside property and smelled white roses and old lies. He arrived at the Aldermere house at 11:45 and went straight to the office on the second floor and locked the door and took out the envelope and read it again, this time more slowly, looking for every buried mechanism, every clause that carried a second meaning, every place where the language had been engineered to mean something other than what it appeared to say. He found 4 of them. She had marked 3. He found the 4th himself, which was either good or irrelevant. Either he was reading correctly, or there was a 5th she hadn't marked, and he was going to find it too late. He put the documents down and called his lawyer, not the firm that handled the alliance documentation. A different man, older, whose name had never appeared on any Vesper-adjacent paperwork, who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Dorian described what he was looking at without describing where it had come from. When Dorian finished, the lawyer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That subsection, if it operates the way you're describing, you'd have essentially authorized a discretionary transfer mechanism with no ceiling and no attribution requirement. The entity holding operational authority over the infrastructure clause would be able to move funds without your direct approval on each transaction. How many transactions before it tripped a regulatory flag? Structured correctly? You could run 40, 50 individual movements under the reporting threshold. Aggregate exposure could reach..." A pause. Dorian heard the man exhale through his nose. "Significant. Very significant." 11:4, Dorian said. Another pause. "That's a specific number." "I know. Dorian." The lawyer's voice changed register slightly. The particular register of a man who cared about the person he was advising and wanted that to be audible without being performed. "Where did this come from?" "I'll tell you when I can." "The alliance documentation. You signed it." "I know. If this is what it sounds like, your signature isn't just a liability. It's the mechanism. You're the mechanism." "I know that too," Dorian said. He hung up. He sat in the Aldermere office for 4 minutes, which was the amount of time it took for the specific quality of his anger to settle into something he could use. He had learned this, that anger, held too hot, burned the hand that carried it, that the useful form of it was lower and harder and quieter, the kind that could be directed rather than detonated. He had learned it in his 20s, in rooms where he had needed to be the coldest person present, and he had gotten very good at it. When the 4 minutes were done, he took his phone back out and called Silas. His uncle answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been watching for the call. "Dorian." His voice was warm. It was always warm. Silas Vale had the voice of a man who had decided, at some point early in his life, that warmth was a more efficient weapon than coldness, and had practiced it until it was seamless. "Hell of a morning." "Yes," Dorian said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. This business with the girl. I have to say, I didn't see that coming. Celeste vanishing like that. Aldrich he's not taking it well. I've been with him since 10. Dorian noted the timestamp. Since 10. He had left the Vesper estate shortly before 10. Silas had been with Aldrich within the same hour. "I'll bet," he said. "What do you want to do?" Silas said. "About the ceremony, the alliance, we need to think about damage control. There are people who know this was scheduled. Word's going to..." "I took the other sister," Dorian said. A pause. 3 seconds. "I'm sorry?" "Marin Vesper. I brought her with me when I left." He said it with the complete steadiness of a man delivering information, nothing more. "I wanted Aldrich to know before the meeting." Another pause. Longer this time. Dorian. The warmth in his uncle's voice had acquired a layer. Not gone, but adjusted, the way a flame looks when the wind hits it from one side. "What do you mean, you took her?" I mean, she's with me, Dorian said. She'll be with me at the meeting. That's not... We can't have her at that meeting. The dynamics are already... 3 o'clock, Dorian said. Aldermere. He hung up before Silas could reframe it. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house, which was the large and appropriate house that Silas had chosen for him and that he had never felt like himself inside. And he thought about that choice, small and seemingly insignificant, a house recommended by someone he trusted because the recommendation was reasonable. And he thought about how many reasonable recommendations could be threaded through 6 years of proximity, each one innocuous, each one advancing something that only became visible when you looked at the total pattern from a distance. He thought about Marin Vesper doing exactly that, looking at the pattern from a distance, alone, in a cold room, over 14 months, until she could see the whole shape of it. He drove back to Krenner Street at 1:30. Callum reported no approaches. The second-floor room was locked from the inside. He knocked. "It's me," he said. The lock disengaged. She opened the door and looked at him, and he saw that she had used the time. She was slightly more composed than when he'd left, her hair rearranged, the particular look of someone who had spent the intervening hours working through something internal and had arrived at a new position. "The meeting is at 3, he said. "Silas and Aldrich. I told them you'd be there." Marin was quiet for a moment. "How did Silas respond?" she said. "He didn't like it." "That's useful." "Yes," Dorian said. "I thought so." She looked at him. The measuring look, the look he was beginning to recognize as her real face beneath every other expression she wore. "What are you going to do when we get there?" "Listen," he said. "I'm going to let them tell me the story they've prepared. I'm going to watch how they tell it, and then I'm going to ask them about Addendum 3, subsection 9. He watched something move through her expression, something quick and controlled, a flicker of the same thing he had seen on the Vesper stairs when she'd handed him the letter. "And if they deny it," she said, "then we have the documents," he said. "And you have the rest of what you've been building for 14 months, and we'll use whatever is necessary." He looked at her. "But I want you to understand something before we walk into that room." "All right. When this opens," he said, "it doesn't close easily. What I do with Silas, what the outcome of that is, it's going to move things. It's going to create a space, and other people are going to try to fill it, including people who are worse than Silas, including people who would look at a woman who can track financial structures across 14 months and see a tool rather than a person. I've been a tool my whole life," she said. "I know how to look like one without being one." "This is different," he said. "This isn't your family." She met his eyes fully. "I know what I walked into, Dorian." It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed it. He did not remark on it. "Then get your coat," he said. "We leave in 20 minutes. She turned to get it, and he was already at the door when she said, "There's a 5th clause." He stopped. "In the documentation," she said, "I marked 4. There's a 5th. It's in the signature block itself, in the witness attestation language. It authorizes an agent of record to execute transfers on behalf of the primary signatory in cases of operational emergency." She turned and looked at him. "The agent of record named in the attestation is Silas Vale." The hallway was quiet. Dorian stood in the doorframe with his hand on the frame and looked at his uncle's name written in the notation of Marin Vesper's very fine pen inside his jacket pocket, and he understood that he was not going to a meeting this afternoon. He was going to a reckoning. The word completed itself in his mind as he stood in the doorframe of the second-floor room on Krenner Street, Marin's voice still in the air, his uncle's name still settling into the space between them like something that had been waiting a long time to land. Agent of record, Silas Vale. It meant that from the moment Dorian had signed the alliance documentation, every transfer authorized under that emergency clause had a legal executor who was not Dorian. It meant the mechanism wasn't just buried in the language. It was complete, operational. It had been operational from the day of signing, waiting only for the wedding to finalize the secondary structures that would make the first movement invisible in the noise of a new alliance's administrative activity. It meant the wedding was not the beginning of the trap. It was the closing of it. Dorian turned back into the corridor. He did not speak. He walked to the end of the hall and stood at the window that looked out over the narrow back of the building, at the sliver of sky between rooftops, and he breathed, slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing a man does when he is deciding what kind of man to be in the next several hours. Behind him, he heard Marin's footstep, once, and then nothing. She had stopped at the threshold of the room, watching him, not filling the silence. He appreciated that about her in a way that was starting to feel inconvenient. "The fifth clause," he said to the window. "How long have you had it?" 3 weeks, she said, "and you didn't lead with it." "I needed to know if you'd read the first 4 yourself before I gave you the fifth," she said. "If you missed all 4, the fifth wouldn't mean anything to you yet. If you read them and found 3, it told me how carefully you were reading. If you found all 4 on your own—" "I found 4, he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I gave you the fifth." He turned around. She was standing in the doorframe still, her coat over her arm, and she was looking at him with the expression that was her real face, the measuring one, the one that was always working, and underneath it, something he hadn't seen before. Not apology. Something more complicated than apology. The look of a person who has been making calculated decisions in isolation for a very long time and is aware perhaps for the first time that the isolation has cost something. "You tested me," he said. "I evaluated the situation," she said. "You were a variable I didn't fully know yet." "And now?" She held his gaze. "Now I know you read fast and you read honestly. Most people read documents looking for confirmation. You were looking for problems." He crossed the hall toward her. She did not step back. He stopped close enough to speak quietly. "If we walk into that meeting and Silas understands what you've given me," he said, "the dynamic shifts from containment to something else. You understand that?" "Yes." "He'll move the risk onto you," he said. "He'll frame you as the source of a fraudulent document package intended to compromise the alliance. He'll tie the charity accounts to you, the unauthorized use of funds from my territory. He has enough to make that case if he needs to." "I know he does," she said. "I built that exposure myself. I knew when I redirected those accounts that it created a vulnerability." "You built a vulnerability into your own position." "I built leverage into his," she said. "If he surfaces the charity accounts, he has to explain how he knows about them. He has to explain why he was monitoring accounts that weren't on any official record, which means he has to explain the monitoring structure, which opens everything else." She looked at him steadily. "He can use it against me, but it costs him more than it costs me." Dorian studied her face. "You've wargamed this." "I've had 14 months, she said, "and very little else to do in the evenings." He almost said something. He stopped himself. He stepped back and said, 20 minutes, and went downstairs. Callum was in the front room. Dorian told him what the meeting was and what he expected from it, and Callum listened without expression and said he'd bring 2 additional men and have them positioned outside Aldermere before 2:45. And Dorian said good, and that was the entirety of the operational conversation because Callum was the kind of person who needed the architecture and could build the details himself. They left Krenner Street at 2:15. Marin sat in the back seat beside Dorian and looked out the window the entire drive, which was 21 minutes, and said nothing, and he said nothing. And the silence between them had acquired a quality that was different from the silence of the morning, less careful, less managed. More like the silence of 2 people who have been moving through the same information and have arrived, independently, at the same destination. The Aldermere house received them at 2:37. Silas was already there. That was the first thing Dorian noted. His uncle standing in the entrance hall of Dorian's own house, positioned near the foot of the staircase, with a glass of water in his hand and his jacket open and his face arranged in the expression of a man who was at home in the space. He had a way of doing that, of occupying a room so that it looked like the room had been organized around him rather than that he had arrived in it. Dorian had watched him do it in negotiation rooms, in restaurants, in the back seats of cars. It was a skill, and it had always read to Dorian as competence. He was reading it differently now. Silas was 61 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with gray hair that had been silver blonde in his youth, and a face that was still handsome in the architectural way of men who had been genuinely attractive once and had let time work on the bones. He had his father's eyes, the same pale gray as Dorian's, the family marker, and he used them the way he used the warmth in his voice, as a managed instrument. He looked at Marin and the instrument calibrated. "I didn't expect—" He caught himself, smoothed it. turned the catch into a movement toward hospitality. Dorian, we should talk before... Where's Aldrich? Dorian said. He's on his way. There were some family matters to it. Sit down, Silas. A pause. Very brief. The pause of a man recalculating in real time. He sat. He chose the chair nearest the window. The chair that faced the room rather than the door. The position of a man who preferred to see everything coming. He set his water glass on the table beside him with the careful placement of someone managing his own hands. Dorian sat across from him. Marin took the chair to Dorian's left, slightly back. Not behind him, not beside him, a position that was neither subordinate nor prominent. A position that said observer, which Dorian suspected was deliberate. Silas looked at her again. Marin Vesper, he said. The warmth was still in his voice, but it was working harder now. I have to say, this morning it's been a lot of moving parts. How are you holding up? She looked at him. Fine, she said. It must be. The situation with Celeste, the disruption to the ceremony. I said I'm fine, she said. The warmth recalibrated again. Silas looked at Dorian. She's resourceful, isn't she? Tell me about the attestation clause, Dorian said. The room changed. It didn't change visibly in Silas. He was too practiced for that. But something in his body did a very small thing, a microscopic adjustment that Dorian caught because he had been watching for it. A tightening at the base of the throat, a fractional shift in the position of the hands. The attestation, Silas began with the voice of a man beginning to construct a bridge while walking onto it. Subsection 9, Addendum 3, Dorian said. Agent of record, your name. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The warmth was still there, but it had changed quality. It was now the warmth of a fire that was deciding whether to bank or burn. That clause is a standard operational. It names you as executor, Dorian said. Specifically, not a generic agent, you. In cases of operational emergency, someone needs to be able to... What constitutes an emergency, Silas? In the language of that clause? A pause. Dorian, read it to me. The definition of operational emergency. Tell me what qualifies. Silas set his water glass down. He uncrossed his legs and recrossed them in the other direction, the movement of a man shifting weight without appearing to shift weight. The language is broader than I think It qualifies anything that falls under the operational discretion of the senior advisory party, Dorian said, which is you, which means you define the emergency, which means there is no emergency clause. There is just a transfer mechanism that you can activate at any time you determine it's warranted. He looked at his uncle. Under documentation I signed. Silas was quiet. In that quiet, Dorian heard the architecture of 6 years, the recommendations and the advice and the good arguments and the reasonable positions, and he heard them with a new frequency beneath them, the subsonic note of something that had been building toward this room for a long time. He did not let himself feel it yet. He filed it. He would feel it later, in private, at a time when feeling it would not cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. You've been talking to someone, Silas said. His voice had come down from warmth into something lower and more precise. The documentation you're describing, you couldn't have read that this morning, not to that level of specificity. Someone read it for you. Someone read it with me, Dorian said. Silas looked at Marin. She looked back at him. And something happened in Silas Vale's face that Dorian had never seen there before. Not anger. He had seen Silas angry, carefully, in controlled increments, not surprise. This was something older and colder, the expression of a man who has been running a long game and has just seen his last significant variable come into alignment against him. She's been in your ear since this morning, Silas said. He was looking at Dorian now, but the words were triangulated, meant to be heard by both of them. Dorian, think about what today was. She helped her sister run. She positioned herself in the wreckage. You walked in and saw a woman standing alone and you read it as innocence. The voice had acquired a pedagogical tone, the tone of an elder correcting a younger person's naive interpretation. That's not innocence, that's construction. I know it's construction, Dorian said. Silas blinked. I know exactly what she built and how she built it, Dorian said. I've been reading the documentation for the last 3 hours. What I want to know is whether you're going to explain the attestation clause, or whether we're going to sit here while you run variations on the framing until Aldrich arrives and you have a second voice in the room. The front door opened. Aldrich Vesper came in with the displaced energy of a man who had spent 3 hours managing a situation that kept outrunning his management of it. He was still dressed formally, the morning's wedding suit slightly loosened at the collar, and his face had the gray, compressed look of a man who had not eaten and had been making phone calls and had found none of the calls satisfying. He stopped when he saw Marin. Not stop the way you stop when you're surprised. Stop the way you stop when you see something you've been trying to prevent and have been unsuccessful at preventing. Marin, he said. Her name in his voice had no warmth and no anger, which was somehow worse than either. It had the flatness of a man addressing a problem. Father, she said, you're going to come home now. No, she said. Aldrich looked at Dorian. She has nothing to do with the... Sit down, Aldrich, Dorian said. Aldrich's jaw tightened. He sat. He chose the chair nearest Silas, which was not a coincidence, and the two men sat on the same side of the room's informal arrangement and looked at Dorian, and the geometry of the situation was visible and had been visible since before anyone walked in. The Alliance documentation, Dorian said, contains a mechanism that I did not knowingly authorize. I'm going to give you the opportunity to explain it before I decide what to do with that fact. Silas and Aldrich exchanged a glance. It was fast. It was the glance of two people who have a shared story and are confirming, wordlessly, that the story is still the story they're telling. There's been a misreading, Silas said. The clause you're describing has your name in it, Dorian said. As a formality, as a... 11.4 million, Dorian said. The room stopped. Silas's face did something in the silence that followed. It was not the microscopic adjustment from earlier. It was larger, a movement across the whole surface, the expression of a man whose internal calculation has just hit a number that tells him the other person knows more than the prepared story accounts for. Where did you get that figure? Silas said. Does it matter? It matters considerably, Silas said, and the warmth was gone now, completely. And what was underneath it was not anger either, but something more fundamental. The focused, patient attention of a man who has operated in dangerous environments long enough that danger doesn't make him loud. It makes him quiet. Dorian looked at his uncle, at the man who had been in the room when he consolidated the territory, who had been beside him at the table when the first major contracts were signed, who had come to the hospital when Dorian's father died and stood at the bedside and said, with what had seemed like grief, that he would make sure Dorian never had to face the business alone. You've been running a parallel structure inside my operation for over a year, Dorian said. The Vesper Alliance was cover. The wedding was the mechanism. The documentation gave you legal authority to move funds you'd been positioning for 14 months. He paused. Tell me I'm wrong. Silas said nothing, which was finally its own kind of answer. Aldrich moved first, not physically, but verbally, the way a man moves when he has been sitting on a contingency and the moment for it has arrived. Dorian. His voice had changed from the flatness of 2 minutes ago into something more deliberate, the voice of a man making an argument he has rehearsed. What you're describing, the structure, the funds, it was built to protect you. The territory has vulnerabilities. There are parties, I don't need to name them here, who have been watching your operation for 2 years, looking for a point of entry. The structure we built was a defensive measure, a way to move assets quickly if the operation came under threat. Without my knowledge, Dorian said. Without the exposure that comes from documented authorization, Aldrich said. If the structure is on paper as yours, it becomes a target. If it's held outside, if it's held under my uncle's name with no record linking it to me, Dorian said, then when it moves, it doesn't move back. Aldrich stopped. 11.4 million, Aldrich, Dorian said, under a clause that your family's lawyers drafted, into a structure that my uncle controls, with my signature on the authorization. He looked between the two men. Tell me the defensive framing again. Dorian. Silas again. The voice had found a new register. Not warmth, not the teacher's tone, something raw, something that might have been the closest Silas came to genuine. You are not equipped to manage what's coming at this territory alone. You haven't been for 2 years. I have been building a buffer. Yes, outside your direct line of sight. Yes, in ways that required structural arrangements you wouldn't have approved if I'd brought them to you directly, because you wouldn't have approved them. You still don't understand the full scope of what is moving toward you. Then explain it to me, Dorian said. I will, Silas said. I will explain all of it, but not in this room, not with her in this room. He meant Marin. He said her the way you say a variable that has disrupted an equation. She stays, Dorian said. Dorian, she stays, Dorian said, or we're done talking. Silas looked at Marin with the long, considering look of a man recalculating the cost of an obstacle. Marin returned the look with nothing on her face at all. She was perfectly still, her coat still folded over her arm, her hands quiet. Then Silas said, "The clinics." The word landed in the room differently from everything else that had been said. Marin's stillness changed quality. Not visibly. She didn't move. But something in the air around her changed, the way air changes when a pressure system shifts. 3 clinics, Silas said. He was not looking at Dorian now. He was looking at Marin. Funded through accounts from Dorian's territory. Accounts that you accessed without authorization and redirected over 18 months. He let that sit for a second. I have the transaction records, every movement, timestamps, amounts, destination accounts. Enough to demonstrate that Marin Vesper has been systematically drawing on funds from this operation for a year and a half. He looked at Dorian. Whatever she's told you, whatever documentation she's given you, needs to be weighed against the fact that she came to you with pre-built evidence against me while sitting on 18 months of unauthorized access to your accounts. The room was very quiet. Dorian did not look at Marin. He kept his eyes on Silas. You've been watching those accounts, Dorian said. I monitor the operation, Silas said. You've been watching accounts that aren't on any official record, Dorian said. Which means you've been monitoring a financial structure that you built outside my direct knowledge and then tracking who else accessed it. He paused. Which means you knew about the clinics. Silas said nothing. How long? Dorian said. Silas picked up his water glass. He took a measured sip and set it back down with the precision of a man who needed something to do with his hands while he decided how much to give. 8 months, he said. The number dropped into the room. 8 months. Marin had told Dorian she spent 8 months building documentation. Silas had known about the clinics for 8 months, which meant Silas had known what Marin was building for almost as long as she'd been building it. You let her keep going, Dorian said. His voice had gone very flat. The useful kind of flat. You knew she was accessing the accounts. You knew she was building a case, and you let her continue. I needed to know the scope of what she had, Silas said. You used her, Dorian said. You let her do the work of documenting the structure, and then you waited until she brought it to someone before you surfaced the clinic exposure. I let her walk into a room with you and hand you a set of documents that, without the clinic transactions, look like evidence against me, Silas said. With the clinic transactions, they tell a more complicated story. A story about a woman who accessed your funds without authorization, who helped her sister flee, who positioned herself in the aftermath of a collapsed wedding and handed a powerful man a package designed to direct his anger away from her family's actions and toward mine. That's not what happened, Marin said. It was the first thing she had said since Silas began. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness now. A fine vibration, the sound a structure makes when it is under pressure. No? Silas looked at her directly. You used Celeste to photograph documents from your father's study. You redirected operational funds into accounts under your sister's name. You've been building a financial and documentary case for over a year. You arranged yourself at the site of a collapsed wedding, handed the result of that work to the man your family was attempting to defraud, and presented it as evidence of concern for his interests. He paused. What would you call that? Survival, she said. The word hung. I call it survival, she said, and this time the evenness had fractured. Not broken, but fractured. The hairline crack visible in the quality of her voice, in the set of her jaw, in the way her hands had closed on the coat in her lap. I call it the only option available to a person who has been invisible in their own house for 20 years, who watched her family prepare to weaponize her sister, who found a conspiracy and had no legal recourse and no resources and no standing in any room that mattered, and built something from nothing because the alternative was doing nothing. She was looking at Silas, and the measuring face was gone, and what was underneath it was something that had been waiting behind a closed door for a long time. You want to call that construction. You want to call it manipulation. Call it whatever you need to. I built clinics. I documented a fraud. I gave the evidence to the person it would harm most to keep quiet. If that's a case against me, make it. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Dorian. She's going to cost you everything, he said, quietly. The pedagogue again, but stripped of warmth now, just the bare bone of it. She came into your house this morning with a plan she's been running for over a year, and you've been inside it since you walked up those stairs. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's made you feel, you are a mechanism in her strategy, same as the wedding was a mechanism in mine. Dorian stood up. He did it slowly, the way he did most things, and the room tracked him the way rooms track men who have decided to stop sitting down. You've been running a parallel financial structure inside my operation for 14 months, he said. You had my signature on a document that would have authorized you to move $11 million through an untraceable mechanism without my knowledge or approval. You knew about the clinic accounts for 8 months and said nothing because you were waiting to use them. He looked at his uncle. And you're sitting in my house telling me that she's the one I should be concerned about. Dorian, get out, Dorian said. Silas stood. Both of you, Dorian said. He looked at Aldrich, who had been silent for the last several minutes with the face of a man watching a situation he thought he had engineered come apart at each seam. This conversation is done for today, not forever. I need the evening. Tomorrow morning, I'll contact you both directly. That's not, Aldrich began. Tomorrow morning, Dorian said. They went. Silas went first without looking at Marin, which was its own statement. Aldrich paused at the door and looked at his daughter with the flat, assessing look of a man who had stopped performing fatherhood some time ago and no longer bothered with the costume. You've made a significant mistake, he said to her. I've made a lot of them, she said. This isn't one of them. He left. The door closed. The Aldermere house was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon had moved into the gray, diffuse light of early evening, and the room had taken on the particular quality of spaces where something has just ended and something else has not yet begun. Dorian stood at the window. Marin had not moved from her chair. He knew for 8 months, she said. Her voice had come back to even, but it was a different evenness now. Thinner, like a surface that has been walked on too many times and is no longer as solid as it looks. Yes, Dorian said. He knew I was building a case, and he let me build it so he could use the clinic exposure as a counter. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, measured, deliberate, the breathing of a person managing something difficult. Then he knows more than I've shown you. He has the transaction records. He has account numbers, timestamps. He has evidence of unauthorized access, Dorian said. He also has 14 months of exposure if he surfaces it in any official context. That's not... She stopped. He heard her take a breath. That's not the threat. The threat is that he uses it privately, not legally. He won't risk the legal exposure. He'll use it with the other council members. He'll circulate it as evidence that I compromised your territory. He'll build a case for removing me from your vicinity before I can produce the documents in any form that matters. She paused. He needs me gone, not legally, just gone. Dorian turned from the window. She was sitting in the chair with her coat still in her lap, and her hands very still, and her face doing the thing it did when she was working through something, the arithmetic behind the eyes. But the arithmetic had a different quality now. Something in the calculation had shifted from strategy to something more personal. The hairline fracture from 3 minutes ago had widened. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. Look at me, he said. She looked up. How many people at the clinics know your name? He said. She blinked. It was a pivot she hadn't anticipated, and the unpivoted moment lasted long enough that he saw it. The face beneath the face, the one that didn't have an answer ready, the one that was simply a person who had been carrying a significant weight alone for a very long time. The director of the second clinic, she said, and 2 staff members at the third. Celeste's name is on all the public documentation, but Silas will find them, Dorian said. If he's had the account records for 8 months, he's been mapping the operational side too. He'll know the clinic locations. He may already have approached the staff. Marin's face went still in a new way. He wouldn't... She stopped herself. She knew better. He could see her knowing better in real time. The women in those clinics, she said, have nothing to do with this, Dorian said. I know. But Silas doesn't distinguish between leverage and collateral damage. He never has. She stood up. The movement was fast, not panicked, but urgent in a way that her movements hadn't been all day. The urgency of a person who has just understood that something she built to be separate from the danger is inside it. I need to... She stopped, looked at him. For the first time since he'd met her that morning, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not about tactics, not about information, but about what to do with her own body in the next 60 seconds. I need to reach the clinic director. She needs to know... You can't contact them directly, Dorian said. Not now. If Silas is monitoring... Those are real people, she said. The evenness was entirely gone now. There are women in those buildings who are there because they had nowhere else to go. If Silas sends someone to use them... I know, he said. You can't just... I know, he said again, and something in the way he said it, the flatness that was not dismissal, but weight, the weight of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and was already calculating, stopped her. She stood in front of him in the gray dress with the coat in her hands and her face open in a way it hadn't been all day, stripped of the composure, stripped of the strategy, just the person underneath, who had built 3 clinics out of redirected money and 14 months of invisible labor, and was now standing in a room in someone else's house, understanding that the thing she had built to be safe might be the thing that got people hurt. Dorian looked at her. He made a decision. Callum, he said. Callum appeared in the doorway within 4 seconds, which meant he had been positioned in the corridor. Sir? The East House on Krenner. I need you to take her there now. Secure the address and stay with her. He looked at Marin. I'm going to make some calls. The clinics will be covered before morning. I need you to write down every name you trust in those buildings. Staff, directors, anyone who knows your face. Give the list to Callum. Marin looked at him for a moment. The open face, the fractured evenness. Why are you doing this? She said. The clinics, he said. 200 to 300 people over 18 months. A 4-month-old. He looked at her. That's a reason. She held his eyes for another second. Then she nodded. A single, small movement. The nod of a person who has run out of the energy required to question something that is being offered cleanly. She went with Callum. Dorian stood in the empty Aldermere house and listened to the front door close and the car pull away from the curb, and then he took out his phone and began to make the calls that would need to be made before the night was over. The first call was to a man named Pryor, who owed Dorian a specific kind of debt and who managed security for 3 of the Outer District properties. The second was to the lawyer on Danforth Street who did not appear on Vesper-adjacent paperwork. The third call he did not make immediately. He stood at the window of the Aldermere house, the house his uncle had chosen for him, in the district his uncle had recommended, positioned on a corner that his uncle had argued was strategically visible. And he looked at the city and he thought about 14 months of parallel construction and the specific patience required to build something inside a person's trust without the person knowing. And he thought about a cold room in an east corridor and a woman turning a piece of paper over with a motion too smooth to be accidental. He thought about Silas saying she's going to cost you everything. He picked up the phone and made the third call. It rang 4 times. Then Silas answered. I thought we were done for today, his uncle said. I need you to tell me one thing, Dorian said. And I need you to tell me honestly, because I will find out either way, and the difference between you telling me and me finding out is the difference between how this goes next. A pause. All right, Silas said. Celeste, Dorian said. She wasn't supposed to run. She was supposed to go through with the wedding and then be removed afterward. Quietly. To make room for Marin to be positioned closer to the operational center. He paused. That was the actual plan. The pause on the other end was long enough that the city outside had time to produce 3 separate sounds. A horn, a siren, a door. You're smarter than your father, Silas said finally. He never would have gotten there. Dorian's hand tightened on the phone. Marin was the real target, he said. It was not a question. Marin controls the financial network that keeps both families liquid, Silas said, and his voice had taken on a quality that might, in another context, have sounded like respect. Has for 3 years. She built it from nothing, inside a family that didn't know she was doing it, using tools they gave her for other purposes. Your Celeste was a beautiful distraction. Marin was always the architecture. Dorian said nothing. And now she's in your house, Silas said. And you think you rescued her. The warmth came back, one last time, cold at the center. She is not a woman who gets rescued, Dorian. She is a woman who selects her next position and walks into it. You are her next position. The line went quiet. Dorian stood in the Aldermere house with the phone in his hand and the city outside in the specific silence of a man who has just had his understanding of the morning rewritten from a new vantage point, and he thought about Marin Vesper in a gray dress at the top of her family's stairs, holding a letter, saying no to her father in a voice with no anger in it, only certainty. And he thought about the numbers on her desk and the inside pocket sewn into the seam and the fifth clause she had held back until she knew how carefully he read. And he thought, Silas was right about one thing. She had selected her next position and walked into it. What Silas had gotten wrong, what the entire construction of the morning had gotten wrong, was the assumption that being someone's next position meant being under their control. He put the phone in his pocket and walked to the front door. He needed to get back to Krenner Street. He needed to look at Marin Vesper and ask her, directly, without documentation or strategy between them, what she had actually come into his life to. He drove himself. No Wren, no Callum. Callum was at Krenner Street, which was where he needed Callum. He took the secondary car from the Aldermere garage, the one that wasn't registered to any name that connected back to the main operation, and he drove through the city in the gray evening light with Silas's last sentence still in the air around him like smoke. She is a woman who selects her next position and walks into it. You are her next position. He drove, and he did not think about whether Silas was right. He thought about what Silas being right would mean operationally, and what it would mean for the evening, and what he was going to do when he walked through the Krenner Street door. He was very good at separating what he felt from what he needed to act on. He had been doing it since he was 19 years old, and had first understood that the world he was inheriting required that separation as a survival condition. He parked 2 blocks from Krenner Street and walked the rest. Old habit. The kind that kept you alive, not because any specific threat existed tonight, but because the habit of looking at your approach before you made it was the reason specific threats never got close enough to matter. The street was quiet. The delivery van from the morning was gone. A light was on in the second-floor window of the Krenner house, the room he had told Marin about, the one with the lock. The rest of the building was dark. Callum met him at the door. Anything? Dorian said. Car came past twice, 40 minutes apart. Different plates, same make. Who? Not ours. Not local enforcement. I ran the plates on the second pass, registered to a holding company out of the Harwick district. Callum paused a fraction. Harwick is where the Vesper secondary properties are. Aldrich's people. Not Silas's, but Aldrich's. Which meant the 2 men had already divided the response between them, which meant they had spoken after leaving the Aldermere house, and had agreed on a division of approach, which meant they were still coordinated, which was information. She know? Dorian said. No. Keep it that way until I talk to her. He paused. Anyone approach the building? No, but the second pass slowed down. They know the address. Dorian nodded and went inside. The front room was dark. He didn't turn the lights on. He went upstairs, and the second-floor hallway had the low amber light of the single lamp at the far end, and the door of the room at the end of the hall was closed, but there was light under it. He knocked. It's me, he said. A pause. Then the lock. She opened the door and looked at him, and he looked at her. And the first thing he registered was that she had been working. The desk in the room had papers on it, organized in the tight column format he recognized from the morning, and she had found a pen somewhere, and there were notes in the margins. She had been building something in the 2 hours since Callum brought her here, which was either industriousness or the compulsion of a person who managed anxiety by working. He thought it was probably both. Silas called you, she said. Not a question. She was reading his face the way she read everything. I called him, Dorian said. He came in. He closed the door but didn't sit. He stood in the small room with the desk and the lamp and the organized papers, and he looked at her and he said, "Marin, I need you to tell me what you came here to do." She looked at him steadily. "I told you?" "Not the documentation," he said. "Not the strategy. What you came here to do." A silence. The particular silence of a person deciding how honest to be with the person in front of them. "Marin, I came to end it," she said. "The structure Silas built, the hold your family and mine have over each other. The way my father has been running the Vesper finances through a network that he doesn't own and can't sustain without your operation underneath it." She paused. "I came to give you enough to pull the foundation out, and I came to be present when it happened so that there was someone in the room who understood the full shape of it. And after," he said, "what happens to you after?" She was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't gotten that far," she said, and the way she said it, without performance, without deflection, simply the statement of someone who had planned a long way into the future and stopped at a specific wall, told him something that the documentation hadn't. She had expected to be expendable at the end of it, not to him specifically, to the situation. She had expected to deliver the evidence, serve the operational purpose, and end up somewhere that wasn't her family's east corridor, but wasn't anywhere she had allowed herself to plan for. He sat down on the edge of the desk. "Silas told me something," he said. "All right." "He told me Celeste was never the target, that the wedding was designed to fail so that you'd be positioned close to me, that you control the financial network that keeps both families liquid." He watched her face. "He said you were the real architecture." Marin looked at him for a long moment. "He's right," she said. "I know he's right," Dorian said. "I knew it before I called him. I'm asking you why you didn't tell me." "Because you would have heard it as manipulation," she said. "The same way you heard it from him." "I'm hearing it from you now." "Now you've had 8 hours," she said. "Now you've read the documents. Now you know what Silas built and why. The architecture I manage isn't a weapon against you. It's the reason both families are still solvent. I built it 3 years ago because the financial structure I inherited was 6 months from collapse, and my father either didn't know or didn't care. And Silas was already beginning to route funds in ways that didn't make sense from a legitimate standpoint." She met his eyes. "I fixed it. I kept it running. I kept it clean enough that it wouldn't attract the kind of scrutiny that brings everyone down. I did that without anyone knowing because no one would have let me do it if they'd known. And it gave you visibility into everything," Dorian said. "Yes." "Which is how you found what Silas was building." "Yes." He looked at the papers on the desk, the columns, the margin notes. "What are you building now?" "A transfer protocol," she said, "for the clinic accounts. If Silas has the transaction records, he can attempt to freeze the accounts through a third-party challenge. I'm setting up a secondary structure that moves the operational funding to accounts with no connection to your territory or my family before he can act." She paused. "I started it an hour ago. I need 3 more hours and access to a specific routing number I don't have memorized." "Where is it?" "In a document at the Vesper estate," she said. "In my room. In the binding of the gray book on the 4th shelf, 3rd from the left." He looked at her. "You hid a routing number in a book binding," he said. "I hid several things in that room," she said. "It was the only space I had." His phone moved in his pocket. He checked it. A text from Callum. "Second car back. Parked this time. Corner of Krenner and Ash." He showed her the screen. She read it. He watched her face process it. The quick calculation, the assessment of what it meant, the landing on a conclusion. "My father's people," she said. "Yes." "He's not going to negotiate," she said. "If he's parked outside—" "He's waiting for instruction," Dorian said, "from Silas. They're coordinated. Silas is the decision-maker in this dynamic. Your father follows when there's a clear direction." He pocketed the phone. "Silas needs the documentation back before it can be used in any formal context. The transaction records are leverage, but they're also exposure. He can't surface them officially without surfacing himself. What he needs is to remove the primary document package from the equation." "The package is in your jacket," she said. "Which is why the car is outside," he said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Marin crossed to the desk and picked up the pen and wrote a number on the corner of one of the sheets and tore it off and held it out to him. "The routing number," she said. "I remember it. I've had it memorized for 8 months. I wrote it in the book because I was afraid of what would happen to my memory if something happened to me." She held the paper out steadily. I don't need the book. He took the paper. How long for the transfer protocol? He said. If I have the routing number, 2 hours, she said. Maybe less. Then do it now, he said. Callum will be outside this door. He went back into the hallway and told Callum what was happening and what he needed. And Callum listened and said he could have 4 additional men at Krenner Street within 30 minutes. And Dorian said do it, and then he went to the front room and called Pryor and told him the clinic locations needed physical coverage tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. And Pryor said he understood and asked no questions, which was why Dorian used him. Then he stood in the dark front room of the Krenner house and he called Silas. It rang once. The documentation, Dorian said. I'll make you a trade. A pause. I'm listening, Silas said. The document package for a full accounting, Dorian said. Every transaction in the parallel structure, every name. The complete architecture, documented, delivered to me privately. We dissolved the structure on terms I set. You keep operational position within the territory at a reduced scope. Aldrich severs the Vesper financial connection on a timeline I determine. He paused. That's the trade. Silence on the line, long enough that Dorian counted it. 8 seconds. Why would you offer that? Silas said. You have the documents. Because what I have is enough to destroy you publicly, Dorian said. And public destruction of my own uncle destroys the territory's stability for 2 years minimum while every competing interest moves into the vacuum. I don't want 2 years of instability. I want resolution. Another pause. Send the package to me tonight, Silas said. I'll have the full accounting to you by morning. No, Dorian said. You'll have the accounting to me in 3 hours. I'll have the package destroyed after verification. If the accounting is incomplete, the package goes to 3 parties simultaneously and the trade is void. 3 hours is achievable, Dorian said, if the accounting already exists, which it does, because you've been managing it for 14 months. A very long pause this time. All right, Silas said. And Silas, Dorian said, the car on the corner of Krenner and Ash. Pull it. The line went dead. 40 seconds later, Callum appeared at the doorway of the front room. Car's moving, he said. Dorian nodded. He stood in the dark room and thought about the trade he had just offered, and the trade he had no intention of making, and the 3 hours he had just purchased. And he thought about what 3 hours was enough time to do if you moved efficiently and didn't waste any of it. He went back upstairs. Marin was still at the desk. She looked up when he came in. The car is gone, he said. What did you do? She said. I offered Silas a trade, he said. The documents for a full accounting. Her face moved. You can't. Those documents are. I'm not going to make the trade, he said. I bought 3 hours. In 3 hours, Silas will understand that I was never going to make it, and the dynamic will change. I need those 3 hours to move the clinic accounts and get the documentation to a location that Silas can't reach regardless of what he does next. She was looking at him with the measuring eyes, working through the logic of it. And then, she said, and then we stop managing this in the dark, he said. 3 hours from now, I call the council. The council was the territorial oversight body. 5 individuals who held collective authority over the operational territory in cases of internal dispute. Dorian had never called them. In 6 years of running the operation, he had never needed to, which was either a testament to his management or, he was now understanding, a testament to how effectively Silas had managed the conditions that might have prompted such a call. Calling the council opens everything, Marin said. I know. Silas has relationships on the council. 2 members at minimum who, I know, he said, which is why what you hand me in the next 2 hours needs to be complete. Every number, every name, every transaction. If I walk into a council meeting with incomplete documentation, Silas uses the gaps. If I walk in with everything, there are no gaps, she said. I told you, 14 months. Then finish the transfer protocol and give me everything else, he said. She turned back to the desk. He left her to it. The next 2 hours were the operational kind. The kind that happened in phone calls and car movements, and the positioning of people in specific locations before specific things happened. Dorian worked from the front room, in the dark, by phone. He moved 3 people to positions adjacent to the council members he trusted. He got the documentation package out of the Aldermere house and into the hands of the Danforth Street lawyer with instructions that were specific about the 3 parties who received it simultaneously if anything happened before morning. At 9:47, Callum came to the front room doorway and said, She's done. Dorian went upstairs. The desk had more paper on it now, the column sheets organized into a sequence, numbered in the top corner, each page cross-referenced. She had created an index on the first page. She held it out when he came in, and he took it, and he stood in the lamplight and read the first page and then the second, and then looked up. "This is everything," he said. "That's what I said," she said. "Silas's full operational structure, your father's connection points, the 14 months of transaction flow." He looked at the index. "This is enough for the council." "It should be enough for a court," she said, "but you're not going to use a court." "No," he said. She looked at him. She had been working for 2 hours straight, and there were ink marks on her right hand, and the paper had left a faint line across her left wrist where she'd been resting it on the edge of the desk. And she was tired in a visible way. Not defeated, not broken, just the legitimate exhaustion of a person at the end of a very long day that had started with a wedding that wasn't a wedding and had arrived here. "The council meeting," she said. "You'll go tomorrow?" "Tonight," he said. She blinked. "It's 10 o'clock. "The council doesn't have business hours," he said, "and Silas is going to figure out inside the next 30 minutes that I was never going to make the trade. When he does, he'll move. I need to be in the room before he makes his calls." He watched her absorb this, the calculation running, the logic checking out. "I need to be there," she said. "I know," he said. "Silas will argue that my presence—" "Silas can argue whatever he wants," Dorian said. "You built the documentation. You understand the structure better than anyone in that room is going to. I'm not walking into a council meeting without the person who knows where every body is buried." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the first time you've said you need me," she said. "I've needed you since 9 this morning," he said. "I was just slower to say it." Something moved in her face. The fracture from earlier, opening a different direction. Not vulnerable. Something more like the expression of a person who has been braced for a blow that did not come and does not yet know how to stand in the absence of it. "Get your coat," he said. We leave in 5 minutes." The council meeting was held at a property in the Marine District, a building that had been used for internal territorial governance for 20 years. Unremarkable from outside, 2 floors, a conference room on the upper level with a long table and chairs that had never been comfortable and were not designed to be. The 5 council members were reached by phone in 40 minutes. 3 arrived within the hour. The 4th came 20 minutes after that, on video from a location outside the city. The 5th, a man named Crew, who had been on the council for 11 years and whose relationship with Silas was one of the 2 that Dorian had flagged, arrived last, at 11:15, with a face that had arranged itself into the expression of a man who had been warned something was coming and had arrived anyway, because the alternative was worse. Dorian stood at the head of the table. Marin sat to his left, not at the foot, not behind him. At his left, with the documentation in front of her, organized in the sequence she had established on the desk at Krenner Street. Crew looked at her when he sat down. "Who is this?" "Marin Vesper," Dorian said. "She's here because she built the documentation you're about to look at, and she's the best person to answer questions about it." "A Vesper," Crew said, "in a council meeting." "In my council meeting," Dorian said. "Yes." Crew looked at Dorian the way a man looks at something he was told to look at a specific way, and is now being asked to look at differently. The next 40 minutes were the hardest 40 minutes of the evening. Harder than the Aldermere confrontation, harder than the car outside on Krenner and Ash, because the work of those 40 minutes was not physical and not strategic. It was the work of making 5 people see the shape of a thing that had been built to be invisible. Marin did most of it. Dorian watched her do it. Watched her take the column sheets and walk the council through them with the patient, precise voice of a person who has organized large amounts of complex information and knows exactly where each piece connects to every other piece. She did not perform it. She did not argue it. She presented it the way you present something that doesn't need argument because it is simply accurate, and she fielded questions with the same evenness, clarifying, cross-referencing, pulling the relevant page before anyone finished asking for it. One of the council members, Aldous, who had been skeptical for the first 15 minutes, stopped her on the 3rd transaction cluster and said, "How do you have this?" "I built the financial network these transactions run through," she said. "I have visibility into every movement inside it. You built it, Aldous said. For whom? For both families, she said, 3 years ago, to prevent a collapse that was coming regardless of what anyone decided to do about it. She looked at him steadily. You can question the ethics of how I acquired the access. I'd rather you do that after you've seen the full picture. Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the page. Crew was the problem. Crew asked questions that were shaped like clarifications but were angled to introduce doubt. Small precision challenges, requests for sourcing that implied the documents might not be what they were. He was good at it. He had the practice quality of a man who had been in rooms like this and knew how to work the margins without being visible about it. Marin handled him differently. The third time Crew raised a sourcing challenge, she looked at him directly and said, "The transaction you're questioning is cross-referenced on page 11 and again on page 17. The discrepancy you're pointing to isn't a discrepancy. It's a timing offset built into the layering structure. It's designed to look like an error to someone reading linearly. If you read the cluster in the order I've indexed it, the sequence is complete." She held his eyes. "I can walk you through it again if you need me to." The way she said, "if you need me to," carried no aggression. It was completely even, but it closed the door on the challenge in a way that was visible to everyone in the room, and Crew did not raise another sourcing question after that. At 12:40 in the morning, the council had seen the full documentation. Aldous spoke first. "The attestation clause alone is grounds for suspension of authority." He was looking at Dorian. Silas Vale operated an unauthorized agent of record mechanism inside the Primary Alliance documentation without council notification. That's a foundational breach. "The transaction structure adds further grounds," said the fourth council member, the one on video. "This isn't a disputed interpretation. This is a documented parallel operation." Crew said, "Silas should have the opportunity to." "Silas has had the opportunity," Dorian said. "He sat in a room with me this afternoon and confirmed the structure was real. He framed it as defensive. The documentation shows what it was used for." He looked at Crew. "He'll have the opportunity to respond to the council directly. I'm not asking for a verdict tonight. I'm asking for a suspension of his operational authority pending full review." A pause around the table. "Seconded," said Aldous. The suspension passed 4-1. Crew voted against. Dorian noted it and said nothing, and filed it in the category of information that would be relevant later. After the other members had left, Dorian stood at the window of the council room with the city below, and the night around him, and the specific exhaustion of a man who has been in a fight that was mostly invisible, and therefore mostly unreleasable. Behind him he heard Marin gathering the documents from the table. The careful paper sounds of a person organizing materials they've been living inside for 14 months. He heard her stop. Then he heard her make a sound. Small. Involuntary. The sound a person makes when a thing they have been holding for a very long time releases, suddenly, at a moment they did not schedule for it. He didn't turn immediately. He gave her 3 seconds. The 3 seconds of a person who respects that some moments need to not be witnessed. Then he turned. She was standing at the table with the papers in her hands, her head bent slightly, and she was not crying. Marin Vesper was not a person who cried in council rooms. He suspected she was not a person who cried often anywhere, but her shoulders had a quality that was different from every other position he had seen them in today. Lower, lighter. The posture of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that they have stopped noticing the weight until the moment it is gone. "Marin," he said. She looked up. Her face was composed. The fracture from earlier had sealed, not into the old surface, but into something new. A different kind of evenness, one that had been through something and knew it. "It's done," she said. Her voice was steady. "The suspension is formal. He can't move the funds." "No," Dorian said. "The clinics are covered tonight?" "Pryor's people are there," he said. "All 3 locations. No one gets in without my clearance." She nodded. She looked down at the documents, then back up. "What happens to you now? With the territory? With the council knowing?" "There's work," he said. "Significant work. Dismantling what Silas built, establishing what the actual operational structure looks like without the parallel layer, managing the fallout when Crew reports back to whoever he's been reporting to." He paused. "It's going to be a difficult several months." "Do you need the network?" she said. "What I manage." He looked at her. I need whoever manages it to be someone I trust, he said. She was quiet for a moment. That's not an answer, she said. Yes, it is, he said. She looked at him, the measuring look. But it was measuring something different now. Not threat and not tactics, but something more personal. The look of a person who has been trying to figure out if a thing is real and is not yet entirely sure and will not pretend to be. You know what you married, she said, this morning. You know what I did, what I planned. You know I used the wedding and positioned myself and gave you the documents in a specific sequence to manage what you understood and when. Yes, he said. And you're still… Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. I fell in love with you, she said. Not the way people say it in stories, not with music under it. With the flat, slightly surprised voice of a person making an empirical statement about a fact they did not plan for and are still not entirely comfortable with. I didn't intend to. It happened somewhere between the third month of watching you run an operation with more integrity than anyone around you deserved, and the moment you walked upstairs to find me this morning, when every calculation said you had no reason to. He was very still. I came into your house with a strategy, she said. The strategy is done. The man I found inside it is not something I planned for. Dorian crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that there was nothing between them but the last several inches of a very long day, and he looked at her. The gray dress and the ink-stained hand and the eyes that were tired now, genuinely tired, in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a person who had run out of the energy required to hold everything back. He put his hand on the side of her face. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then his phone erupted. 3 successive bursts. He pulled it out with his other hand without moving away from her. The screen showed Callum's number, and below it a text that had come in during the meeting that he had only now seen. Silas moved. He's not alone. 4 vehicles, Marin District, heading toward Council Building. ETA 7 minutes from first message timestamp. He looked at the timestamp. The message had come in 9 minutes ago. Callum, he said. Marin had her eyes open. She had read the screen. Her face had changed back into the operational face. The fracture sealed, the tiredness pushed somewhere else, the arithmetic running again behind her eyes. He's already here, she said. From below, through the floor of the council building, came the specific sound of a door that had been opened with force. Not broken, not exploded, just pushed with the momentum of several men who were not asking permission. Dorian looked at the room. 1 door, 2 windows. The table between them and whatever came through that door. Callum was 30 seconds out if he was already moving. He looked at Marin. She looked back at him. Behind the table, he said. No, she said. Marin. I'm not going behind the table, she said. She said, and her voice had the same quality it had when she said no to her father on the stairs of the Vesper estate that morning. No anger, only certainty. And she put the documents under her arm, and she stood beside him and she looked at the door, and the footsteps on the stairs were getting louder. And Dorian Vale stood in the council room of the Marin District property at 12:53 in the morning with the woman he had carried out of a wedding that morning standing at his shoulder. And the door opened. Silas came through it first, which surprised Dorian. He had expected men first, his uncle behind them, the arrangement of a person who sends weight ahead of himself. But Silas came through the door alone, in his jacket from the afternoon, and he stood in the entrance of the council room and looked at Dorian, and then at Marin, and then back at Dorian, and his face had the quality of a man who has made a final decision and is no longer performing anything. Behind him in the corridor there were men. Dorian could hear them. The particular stillness of people who have been told to wait and are waiting with the held tension of a spring. 4 vehicles, Callum's text had said. That was 8 to 12 people minimum depending on how they'd loaded. But Silas had come in alone. Send them home, Dorian said. I will, Silas said. After. After what? Silas looked at the room. The long table, the council chairs, the documents under Marin's arm. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he built and watched be taken apart. The vote, he said. 4-1. Crew called me 20 minutes after it passed. He said it without heat, an accounting of facts. You moved faster than I expected. That's on me. I assumed you'd wait until morning. I know you assumed that, Dorian said. Yes. Silas put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked tired. Not the performance of tiredness, the actual tiredness of a man at the end of something long. I want to talk to you, not negotiate, not threaten, talk. Dorian looked at him for a long moment. Marin stays, he said. Silas looked at her. Something moved across his face, not the cold calculation from the afternoon, something older. Yes, he said. She should hear it too. He crossed to the table and sat down. Not in the council chair at the side. In one of the regular chairs, at the middle of the table, the position of someone who is not claiming authority. He sat, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at them. Dorian pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Marin sat beside Dorian, the documents still in her arms, and she watched Silas with the quiet, total attention of a person who has been building a case against someone for over a year and is now watching that person come apart at their own seams. I'm going to tell you something true, Silas said. He was still looking at his hands. Not because it changes anything, because you deserve to know what you're actually dismantling. Talk, Dorian said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father knew. The room was very still. About the parallel structure, Silas said. Not the Vesper Alliance, that came after, but the original secondary layer, the one I started building 8 years ago. Marcus knew. He asked me to build it. He looked up at Dorian. There were parties moving against the territory 8 years ago that we couldn't address through the official structure without exposing the whole operation. Your father made a decision to hold a reserve outside the visible accounts. He asked me to manage it. I did. Dorian said nothing. When Marcus died, Silas said, you inherited the territory. You didn't inherit the full picture of what was underneath it. Your father intended to tell you himself. He ran out of time. Folks, I am... what? He paused. I made a decision to continue managing the secondary layer without telling you. I told myself it was protection. I told myself you were 26 years old and you were learning to run an operation that had been running for 20 years and you didn't need additional weight. Boros, Wogates. He paused again. I was also, by that point, making decisions inside the structure that I had not cleared with your father. Smaller decisions at first, then larger ones. Over 6 years, the structure I was managing stopped being your father's protective reserve and started being something I was running. For yourself, Dorian said. For the territory, Silas said, and then, after a pause, and for myself. Both things are true. I stopped being able to separate them cleanly a long time ago. Dorian looked at his uncle across the table. At the gray-templed, heavy-shouldered man who had been in the room when the territory changed hands, who had stood at a hospital bedside and offered not to leave him alone in it. He looked at him and he felt the specific, exhausting work of grief that arrives not when someone dies, but when you understand that the version of them you have been carrying was only partially real. The Vesper Alliance, he said, was greed, Silas said, simply. I had been managing the structure for 6 years, and I wanted to consolidate it. The Vesper connection gave me the mechanism. Aldrich understood leverage. We came to an arrangement. He looked down. The arrangement required the wedding. The wedding required Celeste, and Celeste... He stopped. Celeste was a person, Marin said. Her voice was quiet, and it cut through the room cleanly. She was a person who was positioned as bait by her father and by you, and who had enough clarity to walk away from it before it consumed her. Silas looked at Marin, and something in his face did a thing that Dorian had not seen it do all day. It contracted, briefly, the contraction of a man who has encountered a truth he cannot restructure into something more comfortable. Yes, he said. She was. And the women in those clinics, Marin said, did they factor into the arrangement at any point? No, he said. Then there's your accounting, she said. Right there. You built a structure that moved money belonging to an operation that serves real people, for purposes that served you and Aldrich Vesper, and the women who were in those clinics because they had nowhere else to go were so far outside your calculation that you didn't even have to decide to exclude them. They simply didn't exist in the arithmetic. She looked at him. That's the cost of what you built, not the money, not the documentation. That. Silas held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not reformulate. He sat with what she had said in a way that was the closest Dorian had seen him come, in 24 hours of watching him operate, to an honest posture. "What do you want?" Silas said to Dorian. "Not the council, not the formal process. You. What do you want?" Dorian considered the question for a long moment. "I want the full accounting," he said. "Every transaction, every name, every structure, complete. I want it in writing, signed, delivered to my lawyer by 9 tomorrow morning." He paused. "I want you out of the operational territory. Not suspended. Out. You keep your personal assets and your name. You lose the access and the authority and the proximity." "And my people," Silas said, "will be evaluated individually," Dorian said. "People who are following your direction without full knowledge of the structure will be given the opportunity to transfer their loyalty. People who knew what they were doing will be addressed accordingly." "Crew," Silas said. "Crew is a council matter now," Dorian said. "The council handles its own." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "The documents she has," he said. "What happens to them?" "They go to my lawyer," Dorian said. "They're held as security. If the accounting is complete and accurate and the terms are honored, they stay held. If anything moves against the clinics, against Marin, against the operational terms I've laid out, they go to the 3 parties I already designated." Silas nodded. "Aldrich," Marin said. Both men looked at her. "My father," she said to Dorian. "He's not a peripheral party. He built this with Silas. He positioned his daughters as mechanisms. He knew what Celeste was being used for, and he let it happen." She was looking at Dorian, not at Silas. "What happens to him needs to be part of this." "Yes," Dorian said. "The Vesper Financial Network," she said. "The one I manage. My father's family has been drawing from it for 3 years without understanding how it works or who built it. If Aldrich loses access, the Vesper family finances become his problem to solve without infrastructure. That's—" She paused. "That's significant exposure for people in that house who had nothing to do with what he did. My mother, the staff." "Your mother knew," Dorian said, quietly. Marin was quiet for a moment. "She didn't stop it," she said. "That's different from knowing." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at the documents in her arms. "I can restructure the network access, create a partition. Aldrich loses the operational layer. The household accounts are separated and protected. It takes about a week." She paused. "If you'll let me." "You'd protect your family's household finances," he said, "after what they did." "I'd protect the people in the house who aren't my father," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her. The ink-stained hand, the gray dress, the face that had been doing its job all day and was still doing it, even now, even here, at nearly 1 in the morning in a council room with a tired old man across the table and everything broken open around them. He had carried her out of a house that morning because he had seen something in her face that he couldn't name yet. He thought he could name it now. "1 week," he said. "And then the partition is permanent." She nodded. He looked at Silas. "The men in the corridor, send them home. Walk out with them. Have the accounting to Danforth Street by 9. Silas stood. He stood slowly, the way men stand when they are older than they want to be and have just spent the last of something they can't replenish. He pushed his chair in, which was a strange, small, fastidious gesture. The gesture of a man with ingrained habits that survive his worst moments. He looked at Dorian. "Your father would have done the same thing," he said. "In your position, he would have been angrier about it. He had less patience." He paused. "But he would have made the same call." "Don't," Dorian said. Silas stopped. "Don't use him," Dorian said. "Not tonight. Not for this." Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, small movement. The nod of a man accepting a limit. He walked to the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back once, not at Dorian, at the room itself. The table, the chairs, the window, all of it. With the expression of a man taking a last look at something he is not going to see again. Then he went into the corridor and Dorian heard his voice, low and instructional, and the sound of the men in the corridor responding, and then footsteps, receding, down the stairs, and then the front door, and then nothing. The council room was quiet. Marin set the documents on the table. She set them down carefully, the way you set down something you have been gripping for a long time, and she put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Dorian watched her. "It's done," he said. She exhaled, a single, slow breath that carried the weight of a year and a half in it. "Almost," she said. "The accounting still has to come in. The partition has to be built. Crew is still a variable." She paused. "And Aldrich?" "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He stood up and crossed around the table and stood beside her, close, and she turned her head and looked at him, and they were both exhausted in the bone-deep way of people who have been running on the fuel of necessity and have just arrived at the moment where necessity runs out. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." "When Silas said you were the real target," he said, "that the network you built was what they were actually after. Did you know that before this morning?" She was quiet. "I suspected it," she said. 4 months ago, I found a document reference in my father's study. Not a full document, a notation, a reference to what he called the infrastructure asset. I didn't know what it referred to at first. Then I worked backward from the transaction structure, and I understood. "And you kept building the case anyway," he said. "The case was already built," she said. "I kept building the protection around the clinics anyway. Because once I knew I was the target, I knew I had leverage. And leverage is only useful if you're holding something the other side can't afford to lose." She paused. "I was the thing they couldn't afford to lose. That meant I could move." "You used yourself as leverage," he said. "I used myself as the variable they'd underestimated," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. He thought about a 20-year history of being put in a cold room at the end of a corridor and given less than was needed and being expected to stay small and stay quiet. And what a person does with 20 years of that when they are the kind of person Marin Vesper was. Not broken by it, not destroyed, but sharpened, slowly, deliberately, into something that the people who had designed the cold room had no framework for imagining. "You're not going back," he said. She looked at him. "To the Vesper estate," he said. "To your family's house. You're not going back." "No," she said. "I'm not." "Where do you want to go?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do all day. She almost smiled. Not fully. A partial thing, arriving at one corner of her mouth, there for a second, and then gone. "I have no idea," she said. "You can have the East House," he said. "Krenner Street, for as long as you need it." "That's your house," she said. "It's the house I use when I don't want to be somewhere I'm monitored," he said. "You can relate to that." She looked at him for a moment. The partial smile came back, marginally more complete. "Yes," she said. "I can." He put his hand on the table beside hers, not touching, near. She turned her hand over and put it on top of his. They stood there in the council room of the Marine District building at 1:15 in the morning, with the documents on the table and the city outside the window, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. The weeks that followed were difficult in the way that the aftermath of structural collapse is always difficult, which is to say, not dramatically, but relentlessly. The accounting arrived at Danforth Street at 8:47 the next morning, 47 minutes ahead of the deadline, which told Dorian that Silas had been building it in the hours between the council meeting and 9 a.m., which told him that the accounting had been essentially complete for some time and that the decision to produce it had been made sometime in the night, and that whatever Silas had decided in that night, he had decided cleanly. It was complete. Dorian's lawyer spent 4 days reviewing it against the documentation Marin had produced, checking every transaction cluster against every cross-reference, and at the end of 4 days called Dorian and said he had found one discrepancy and 2 ambiguities and believed both ambiguities were attributable to the complexity of the structure rather than deliberate omission. The discrepancy was a transaction that had cleared after the accounting was compiled and appeared on neither document. When Dorian asked Silas about it through the lawyer, the response came back within 2 hours with a full explanation and supporting documentation. It was, Dorian thought, the most honest Silas had been with him in 6 years. Aldrich Vesper was harder. Not because Aldrich resisted. He didn't, not fully, not once the council's suspension of Silas was formalized and the scope of the documentation became clear to him. He resisted in the way of a man who has lost the structural support of his position and is negotiating not to keep it, but to preserve what he could from the wreckage. The Vesper family finances were partitioned as Marin had described. Aldrich's operational access severed, the household accounts separated and protected. The family name remained intact, which was more than Dorian had been inclined to offer at the beginning, and which Marin had argued for on behalf of the people inside that house who were not Aldrich. Dorian had listened to her make that argument and had thought about what it meant to advocate for partial protection of the people who had put you in a cold room for 20 years. And he had agreed to it because the argument was sound, and because watching her make it told him something about the quality of the person making it that he did not want to diminish by overruling it. Celeste was not found. She was not looked for by anyone who had Dorian's resources, because Dorian had decided, on the morning after the council meeting, that Celeste Vesper had earned whatever distance she had managed to put between herself and the people who had used her as a mechanism, and that the reach of his operation was not going to be used to close that distance. He told Marin this directly. She had been at the Krenner Street desk, her desk now, functionally, covered in the organized notation of the network restructuring she was working through. And she had looked up at him and she had said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried more weight than 2 words usually carry. "She's safe," Dorian said. "Not a question." "She has resources, and she's smart, and she made a clean exit," Marin said. "She's safe." "Good," he said. And that was the last time either of them spoke of it. Crew was addressed by the council itself, in a process that took 3 weeks and produced a formal censure and a reduction of council authority, which was as far as council processes went by design, and which was enough for Dorian's purposes. Crew's external relationships, the parties he reported to when Silas needed information from the council, were documented and mapped by Marin in the same methodology she had applied to everything else, and that documentation went to the lawyer on Danforth Street and sat in the same secured file as the original package. An arrangement had been established. Crew understood the arrangement. The clinics remained open, all 3. Pryor's people stood down from direct security coverage after the first week, when it became clear that the threat had dissolved with Silas's exit from the operational territory. Dorian established a funding structure for the clinics that was legitimate, documented, traceable, and entirely under his name. Not Celeste's name, not a shell structure, his name, with clear records and clean accounts. He did it without telling Marin first. She found out when the first transfer confirmation came through to the network she managed. She came to find him. He was in the main residence, the Aldermere house, which he was spending more time in now, partly because the logic of using Krenner Street for privacy had shifted since Marin had taken up residence there, and partly because he was beginning to understand that the house he had never felt like himself in might feel different once it stopped being the house his uncle had chosen for him. She stood in the doorway of the second-floor office and looked at him and said, "The clinic transfer." "Yes," he said. "It's in your name." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That creates visibility for you that—" "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." She looked at him for a moment more. Something moved through her expression. Not the partial smile. Something fuller and more complicated. The expression of a person encountering an unexpected generosity and not knowing immediately what to do with it. "Why?" she said. "Because those clinics exist because you built them," he said. "And you built them with the only resources you had access to, which were resources you had to take without permission from people who would never have given permission. The fact that they exist shouldn't be held at that angle forever." He looked at her. "They deserve to exist cleanly. So does the work that built them." She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she crossed the room and sat across from him, and she put her folded hands on the desk between them, and she looked at him with the eyes that had been calculating everything all day for a very long time and said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I planned everything about this morning," she said. 14 months of it. I knew the wedding would fail. I knew Celeste would leave. I knew where you'd be positioned and what you'd see and what I needed you to conclude. I set all of it up." She held his eyes. "What I did not plan, and what I could not have planned, and what has made the last several weeks the most genuinely disorienting of my life, is you." She paused. "Not what you could do for me strategically, not what you represent operationally. You. The person who went upstairs when he didn't have to. The person who read to the 4th clause and found it before I gave him the 5th. The person who made a fake trade with Silas to buy 3 hours and spent those hours protecting things I built. She paused again. I'm not accustomed to being visible, to being seen in a way that is not strategic. I don't have good mechanisms for it. I noticed, he said. I'm telling you because you should know what you're working with, she said. I will second guess everything. I will calculate when I should trust. I will protect things I care about by building walls around them before the threat arrives. And sometimes the wall will go up in front of you. She looked at him. That's not going to change entirely. I can tell you that I know it about myself. I can tell you that I'll try to tell you when it's happening. He looked at her across the desk of the house that was becoming his in a different way than it had been before, in the city that continued to be the city, in the morning light that came through the Aldermere windows regardless of what happened in the rooms behind them. I run a criminal operation, he said. I have made decisions that would not survive examination by the standards I'd prefer to be held to. I have been loyal to people who did not deserve it, and I have been slow to see what was being built in the space my loyalty created. He paused. I'm not working with clean material either. No, she said. You're not. So we're even, he said. The partial smile arrived, fuller than before. It changed her face in a way that was specific to her. Not a transformation, not a softening, but an opening, the face of a person who has decided that something is worth the exposure. We're even, she said. The second wedding was held 6 weeks later, not at the Vesper estate, not at the Aldermere house, at the Krenner Street property, which was small and unremarkable from the outside and had a back garden that Dorian had not known existed until Marin found it, because the previous tenant had cultivated it and left it, and it had continued growing without anyone's attention, which was the kind of thing that happened to things left alone long enough. There were no white flowers. There were no arranged chairs or string quartets or families performing alliance. There were 8 people: Dorian, Marin, Callum, Wren, the Danforth Street lawyer and his wife Pryor, and a woman named Sasha who ran the second clinic and who Marin had called the morning after the council meeting and who had arrived 20 minutes later with the contained, practical urgency of someone who had been waiting to know things were safe and was relieved to receive the confirmation. The morning was clear. They stood in the back garden of the Krenner Street house in the plain daylight. No ceremony, no performance, and Dorian looked at Marin and she looked at him, and she was wearing a dress that was not gray, a deep blue, the color of deep water, chosen by herself, which was different from every dress she had worn in a house where the choosing had belonged to other people. And her hair was down, which he had not seen before, and she had left the glasses on, which he had expected, and she was looking at him with the eyes that had been measuring everything and which were now measuring only this. You should know, she said quietly, before anyone spoke the formal words, that this is the first decision I've made in this direction that isn't also a calculation. I know, he said. How do you know? Because you told me about the walls, he said. You only do that when you're not building one. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, all right, in the voice that was her real voice, the one beneath every other voice, the one that had said no on her family's stairs and survival in his council room. And I fell in love with you at 1 a.m. after everything had burned and been rebuilt. And she took his hand, and the morning continued, and the city continued, and the garden that had grown without anyone's attention grew around them both. Later, when the 8 people had gone and the Krenner Street house was quiet, Marin stood at the window that looked out over the narrow street, the window where she had sat the first night, building transfer protocols in the lamplight, and Dorian stood beside her. What do you want to do with it? He said. The network, the operation, the whole construction. She thought about it honestly, which she did with everything, took the question apart, and looked at the components and put them back together before she answered. I want to build something worth protecting, she said. Not worth defending, worth protecting. There's a difference. She looked at the street. The clinics are the beginning of that. There are other structures that could work the same way. The financial infrastructure redirected toward things that hold instead of things that accumulate. That's a significant reconfiguration, he said. Yes, she said. I know how to do it. I know you do, he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. The deep blue dress, the glasses, The face that had been managing the world's expectations of it for 20 years and had, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, stopped managing quite so hard. "It won't be clean," she said. "Any of it. The territory has history. You have history. There will be things we can't fix and decisions we'll have to make that we won't feel right about afterward." "Yes," he said. "I want to do it anyway," she said. "I know," he said. "So do I." Outside, the city moved the way it always moved, without concern for the people inside it, without celebration or condemnation, simply forward, the way cities move, the way time moves, indifferent and continuous and holding everything inside it, whether the people inside it were ready or not. Dorian Vale had arrived at a wedding that morning, a different morning, 6 weeks and an entire previous life ago, to marry a woman he had never met, and he had left carrying a different woman out of the wreckage, and the woman he had carried had turned out to be the only thing in the entire construction that was real. The Mafia Boss had come for the Golden Daughter. He had found, in the cold room at the far end of the hall, the only person who had ever understood what he was actually building, and the only person strong enough to help him build something better from the ruins of what they had both survived. The morning light came through the Krenner Street window. They stood in it together. That was enough. That was, for the first time in a long time, more than enough.